Is the video ready? Is the audio ready? All right, everybody. We're all set with audio? Okay. Thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to see so many people at a policy meeting. I am asymptomatic, but less than a week out from a positive test, so I thought wearing a mask would be the right thing to do, unless you want me to breathe on all of you, and it's all good. So that's the reason for my mask, obviously self-explanatory. Tonight, we're having a little bit of a different setup. This is the first policy committee meeting that is convening after the reorganization in December. And one of the things that we consistently heard throughout the reorganization process is that the public didn't seem to have enough engagement or voice with the board directly. And since policy is a board committee, I wanted to take some of the formality away from it. It is still a working committee with an agenda that we need to go through, but there will be a little bit of a different type of agenda in that we will not have 3-minute limits to public comment. We will not have any reason to, you don't necessarily need to feel the need to soapbox. We are actually going to be going through the agenda and working through the policies on the agenda and revising them, wordsmithing them, and doing the work of the policy committee. So that process is obviously new for some. We have committee members, formal committee members, all sprinkled throughout at every table, administration as well as board representation. So in calling the meeting to order, we'll go through attendance, and attendance is taken, and just so everybody is familiar with who is on the committee, we won't make everybody introduce themselves. That is just in attendance from the community. But that way you'll have an idea who the committee members are. Dr. Russell, myself, Mr. Keenan, Mr. Saylor, Dr. Weston, Mr. Marsh, Mr. Cleland, Mr. Ganesh, Dr. Boyd I didn't see, but she's on the committee as well. Mr. Weaver, Dr. Dietrich is not in attendance. There are also several other administrators in the room, and their input is obviously valuable as well. So with that, we will go right into the review of the cycle of policies. There are no policies for January. And so we'll move to section 3, which is the legal policy PNN recommendations. Dr. Russell.
Thank you. And just a comment about the review cycle. Our district moves through a 6-year review cycle and reviews each and every policy on that 6-year cycle. And because we're ahead, and we anticipated some rich conversation this evening, there are no policies on the review cycle, but you will see policies populated in that section again down the road. So we'll move into the legal, or the policies that come to us from the Pennsylvania School Board Association through what's called a PNN, a Policy Network News article. And really the purpose is to provide guidance to school districts about their policies and what they set up. Late in 23, we received a PNN that included updated language in policy or for policy 815, which is our acceptable use policy. That policy was actually discussed for the first time in November. It went to a first reading at the board level and then was requested to come back to policy because we've had a changeover in the committee makeup. So it's an opportunity for us to look at 815 again. Typically what happens is this committee discusses policy. If the committee agrees with what's presented, it moves to a first reading of the board, and it'll appear on the agenda. The board then has an opportunity to review it. If it moves forward to the next month, that's referred to as a second reading, and then it's acted on. So policy is developed and approved by our board. That's their responsibility. So they get a little bit more time to review it when the committee makes suggestions or recommendations. So 815 went to the board for a first reading and has come back for review. And in 815, administration is recommending the PSBA language that was presented in 815. It is It is presented there for you. You can see what they are recommending to us. Administration is recommending that and believes that the explicit language presented in 815 puts the district in a strong position in helping those in the community accessing the internet or using the network to know what sorts of information they cannot access. That's really what's called out in this policy. And it puts the district in a strong position in helping individuals to be very aware of that. So administration does recommend the language in PSBA's version of 815.
So, Dr. Russell, just to pause there, 815 is not a brand new policy. It was a policy that we already have as part of our set and approved policies. This is an update that came down from the state with revisions that we are reviewing and then adopting or changing.
That's right. So PNNs often include revisions to existing or active policies, they're called. Sometimes there are new policies. You will see a new policy tonight that the state is suggesting we implement, or school districts across the Commonwealth implement, and it's actually in support of military families, I believe, or children. But 815 existed. It's an active policy. And again, every so often, just like we review, we move through a review cycle, so does PSVA. And they pass those recommendations on to school districts.
Or the board can take a policy and ask for it to be reviewed outside of the cycle of policies.
That's correct, and that would then fall into the local section. So
Correct,
yes.
which
Yeah.
where we don't have any this month, right? So I just say that all in terms of just a point of education for the folks that are not familiar with the policy procedure. All of these are found on the district website under board docs. Under policies are all of our active policies. They're all listed by section. 815 is in section 800, et cetera, et cetera. There are not printed out copies for anybody, but they are all available online digitally. If you were to bring a laptop or a device of some sort, you could obviously go through. They're projected there. I realize they're hard to see on the screen. But in terms of what the policy committee actually functions and does, they literally read through each policy ahead of the meeting, make any notes, have any changes, suggestions, and come to the meeting with those suggestions or have those conversations at that point. So in full transparency, again, in this setup here, Donna, you had asked if there's teams or pods or whatever. Definitely not. Anyone is free to talk. We are still a working meeting, so I would ask just if you raise your hand, you can have the floor, say what you have to say with regards to the policy language, how you think it should change or stay the same, and then we'll move on from there. Notes are taken throughout, policies are updated, and then ultimately the committee comes away with a recommendation, and then that gets brought to the board in the next board meeting. That's the process. So it's not, behind the curtain. This all happens in public, just normally no one joins us when we sit and do all of this work. But that's all for the benefit of those that have never been to a policy meeting. Are there any questions? Because I know the format is very different. Okay, go ahead, Dr. Russell.
Thank you. The only other thing that I'll call out as we start to go through the policies, 815 shows you some green, highlighted in green, that represents the edits that have been made from the active policy or the policy that currently exists. So if you're in board docs, under the board docs tab, this policy 815 is listed as an active policy over here. The proposed changes are in the attachment that appears below the table, or for board members and administration with access, there's also a draft section. So this version is clear. This is the current version of 815. That's in the active tab. If I go to the draft tab, that's where administration has incorporated some edits. It also appears on the agenda underneath as an attachment.
Mrs. Lofton, go
That
ahead.
looks different. Yeah.
You just turn your microphone on just so the audio, the visual,
So, Dr. Russell, the public does not have the draft tab.
They don't, correct, but they have
Right.
the attachments. You're right.
But-
they don't have access to the draft, but I see that the attachment looks different than the draft.
Yeah, so the attachments
Yeah.
don't have those edits.
They're not highlighted in green.
Correct.
I think they're in bold. I was comparing that. Is it not?
They should be in green. So I'll talk to Ms. Widener about that.
Okay.
That's a good
Thank you.
point. So that, again, may be confusing. What I can do is go back to the draft. I apologize for that. We want the color to show up in the attached version because, as Mrs. Lofton has pointed out, not everybody has access to the drafts. But I will pull up the draft and scroll through it, and Mr. Ganesh and I can sort of tag team. We have incorporated the language from PSBA with a little bit of PV language also incorporated in. So happy to entertain questions that you might have.
Did anyone on the committee have any changes, or were the changes as presented acceptable? Opening up the conversation. Okay. Say one more time. Go for it. Yeah.
So I do have a question, and I'm not sure what page this is on. It's underneath authority, and then there's all the bracketed copy of the optional ones that were listed of subject areas that are deemed inappropriate matter. And maybe this is just a copy editing issue, but if we say, for example, that bullying cannot be information about bullying cannot be accessed. But down below, we're requiring people to go through training on cyberbullying. So we're telling people that they have to have bullying training through our computers, but they're not allowed to access information about bullying. So, I understand that we don't want to be our students engaging in activities that are bullying, but I imagine that they might want to be doing research about bullying or learning about how to combat bullying. And so perhaps that's a copy editing change that needs to happen. And then I also wonder about weapons, because I imagine that could be something that you're learning about in social studies class. If you're learning about, for example, the atomic bomb or something of that nature, again, yeah, and so perhaps it's just, I think I understand the intent, but the intent doesn't, the way it's written is very broad. Yeah. So perhaps there's some tweak that can be made to that.
Well, that punch 5, is that what you're talking about, cyberbullying?
Yes.
Yep.
That's state law. That's why it's in the policy.
Okay. So then why are the punch ones are all the ones that are essentially optional for boards to choose to implement? So then why, if it's the state law that has to be in our policy, why is it optional from PSBA?
2 different laws. One's, they're 2 different separation laws in the policy. So the cyberbullying one is the Act 14.
So let me look at.
Expires at the end of this year.
Oh, it's not hyperlinked in the, anyway, just something to look at. Again, maybe that's just a wording change that needs to happen. Maybe it's content that is bullying as opposed to anything about bullying is inappropriate.
Research for educational purposes. or
Right.
something
Right.
like that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to explore what Mr. Saylor's bringing up and the law connected to why this was listed as an option, but I also agree. I think those are valid points, and I'd like Mr. Ganesh and I to have some time to review both examples, also look into the law as driving why they were listed here, and then we can follow up in the notes.
Okay.
I appreciate the
Thank you.
comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Is there any other conversation? Dr. Weston?
Yeah, with reference to that, with regard to the bullying, the reference for that statement, it's not hyperlinked in the document, but we're referring to our own policy 249, which, basically says, you know, as I'm reading it here right now, the board prohibits all forms of bullying by district students, and it goes on to talk about Title IX and some other things. I'm not seeing necessarily references to state law, and I'm wondering if that's really the correct reference for that particular thing. I mean, yes, bullying is outlawed, it's prohibited, but is that what that sentence is actually referring to? And I agree with Mrs. Lofton. I think she raises a good point that I didn't really pick up on before. That, you know, there may be legitimate reasons to look at information along these lines. It kind of reminds me of some of the things with in the early days of filtering software, where people would try to do research, say, on breast cancer, and that type of information was filtered out because it was blocked by the filter as a sexual reference, whereas it was not ever intended to be. I think some examination of the language might be warranted.
Agreed, thank you.
Are there any other comments or public input? So Dr. Russell, I'm so sorry, I didn't see you, Mrs. Mears.
I just want to say that I'm grateful to see that this language and this recommendation, and this is a good start. I hope to see our district take this and apply it to more than just digital or internet resources. But I just want to say I'm really supportive of this, so thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, Dr. Russell, so you're going to review that with Mr. Ganesh further, and then we'll see it back.
We will actually put follow-up in the notes, and
Wonderful.
then the board can consider that.
Wonderful.
For the board meeting February 5th. Thank
Great,
you.
thank you. Moving on.
Okay, so the rest of the PNNs, if you happen to have had an opportunity to read through, they really reference benefits for military families or children of military families. So Policy 200 enrollment, they were updated to include the requirements for advanced enrollment. So we need to consider certain aspects of enrollment when children may be moving around or a part of a military family. Administration is recommending what PSBA has recommended for each of these policies, and each of the sets of changes or revisions relate to children of military parents, or at least one parent. Enrollment, if they are a non-resident student but planning to move into the district, there are some exceptions made for them. When we get to graduation, there's an AR that indicates a student may wear his or her uniform if they are headed into the military. And then Policy 254 is actually a new policy. So here's an example of a new policy that was developed by PSBA, not a set of revisions coming to us for an active policy, but it's a new policy. Administration recommends that the board adopt this policy. Again, it speaks to the educational opportunities for military children. And lastly, in the PNNs, we received notification about 810, which is transportation. So this is unrelated to military families now, but we did get a note. There was a legal citation that was added relating to the board purchasing, equipping, and or maintaining school buses. We contract transportation, so it's a little less, it's more indirectly related to our work, not as directly related as the previous ones that were listed in the PNN.
Thank you, Dr. Russell. Does committee or public have any comments with regards to the remaining PNNs? Seeing none, we will move to Section 401, which is the local policies review. Dr. Russell?
Policy 006 is a board policy that helps guide the governance on the part of our directors. And Policy 006 also articulates the components that are a part of a typical board agenda. The board meets twice each month, and there are particular sections called out in policy that need to be included. There has been a recommendation to incorporate a moment of reflection as one of the components that would be included on the agenda to follow the Pledge of Allegiance, more specifically. So if the committee agrees with that change, it will be incorporated into the language, into the draft, and presented to the board for a first reading in February.
Does anyone have any, and it's procedural, in order to incorporate the moment of reflection during a board meeting, the recommendation, the ask was to actually present it formally to policy committee for discussion. Does anybody have any comment or question regarding that, either on the committee or in the public? Okay.
Great. So that will move to first reading then. Okay, excellent.
Thank you, Dr. Russell.
All right, so let's talk about Policy 109, resource materials. This policy has been a part of conversation for some time now. And it originally, when it was brought up, referenced resource materials. Over time, if you've been following the conversations, it shifted to take on the title of library resources because the real questions come into play with respect to selection and content of some of our library books primarily. However, at the policy committee meeting in November, it was suggested that we go back to resource materials away from just library resources, so generalize the language a little bit. In the policy conversations that have happened to date, there have been a lot of questions about the definition of sexually explicit content. This has raised questions for some in our community. You're here this evening. I've shared, you've engaged with the board in public about some concerns. As a school district, I can appreciate what's been raised to the administration. We also recognize that students see themselves in books in the library, and we don't want to censor. We don't want to violate First Amendment rights. So what's being proposed this evening as we come back to 109 is a statement that really is specific, not about sexually explicit, because when we read words, whether or not those words are sexually explicit could be subjective. However, there is some language in 815 that speaks to graphics and images. So administration is recommending consideration that when a book includes an image that would be defined as a sexual act, it be prohibited from being in the library, an image. So if you look at Policy 109 and what's being proposed in the draft, and there have been a lot of changes here, so it's messy. It's not as straightforward. The statement that I'll bring your attention to is here. Under selection guidelines, number 1, second sentence. That is a revision that is being proposed to Policy 109 to help guide the selection process.
So with that, we'll open up the conversation. Go ahead.
If I could,
Go ahead,
Ms.
Dr.
White, I'm
Russell.
sorry.
Of course.
One other thing. There was also a recommendation coming out of the last policy committee meeting to reincorporate statements under delegation of responsibility that used to be in the policy, and for some reason, they were removed, they were pulled. Administration supports putting them back in. And again, it supports our selection of resource materials for our students. So you will see, under delegation of responsibility, these green statements here have been reinserted into the policy language.
Right, and I appreciate you saying that. That was going to be one of my first points, is that this particular policy, when first brought for review to the policy committee, it has gone through some iterations of wordsmithing and editing and revisions. So I have multiple versions of notes that I've taken, but at this point, I'll open the floor for anyone that has questions or comments. Dr. Weston?
With regard to the numbered points under delegation of responsibility, are those in the current policy 109 that we're working on?
They are not, because they were removed upon a last review or the most recent review a couple years
Okay.
back. For some
I
reason,
thought these were things that had been, put in the course of review, and then they came out, and then they put in and came out. Personally, I think they are a little too overly directive to be part of a policy. I could see those in an administrative regulation, but as part of a policy, I'm not sure. But if you, as administration, are okay with it, I would not object to it. I still think I don't think it's the policy's business necessarily to tell you exactly how to do this, but again, this is the thing that it's telling you to do, and if you're good with that, if this is how you want to do things, that's good with me. The other thing with regard to the selection guidelines and the added sentence, I'm really sorry, but I do not like this addition, and it's worded as something that is very difficult to object to. But there's a couple things here. First of all, it's cherry picking, basically. You're talking about disqualifying an entire work based on what might be one single image in the work. And I don't think that's right. You're throwing out something that could be, something that's a valuable addition to the library based on potentially a single image. And we've seen that in a couple of the reviews of books that have been challenged over the last couple of years. There were a couple graphic novels that were included in the challenges that arguably could be considered to have images like this, and were overwhelmingly recommended for inclusion in the library, to keep in the library. So, if you had this specific direction in there, you'd be throwing those books out, despite the fact that they were reviewed by a review committee and said, we should have these books in our library. These are things that are a valuable addition. So, yeah, I'm sorry. I can't agree to that language. If you want to have something in there that's more directive, I'd say go back to some of the state law that is cited in Policy 815, some of the federal law that's cited there, and look at the definition of material that's harmful to minors. I think that is a guideline that we should be following, because it requires you to look at the work as a whole and not just cherry pick images that somebody might find offensive and say, because you've got this one image out of a large book, the whole thing is worthless.
So, Dr. Weston, do you think that we should follow what the Department of Justice says on what's harmful to minors? That's what you said, right?
That was basically what I said.
Department of Justice says harmful to minors includes any communication consisting of nudity, sex, erection.
There's a three-part definition.
No.
And no.
It says any.
No, it's a three-part definition, and you got to check all the boxes.
Well, everyone's a minor that has access to the library, so he checks that box. Offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community, so we check that box. And lacks serious lacks serious literacy and artistic value. And so, for instance, the books that I've challenged, when each book has a literacy rating, the literacy ratings are middle school or elementary school, because the graphic novels aren't well worded. So it literally checks all three boxes.
Yeah,
so I'm glad that you think that we should follow what the Department of Justice says.
I strongly disagree with your characterization, Mr. Saylor, as did the review committee that reviewed those challenges.
No, the review committee said that the book met the guidelines based off of Policy 832, and that the book in question was talking about a student or two characters that were part of the LGBTQ community. That's why, literally, that was the response from the review committee on Fun Home. It had nothing to do about what we're talking about now.
I think it has everything to do with what we're talking about.
I'm just going off of what it said.
Predominantly appeals to the prurient, shameful, or morbid interest of minors. Taken as a whole, appears to a prurient interest in nudity, sex, or excretion. Does not. The work as a whole does not. It depicts, describes, or represents in a patently offensive way, with respect to what is suitable to minors, an actual or simulated sexual act or sexual contact, actual or simulated normal or perverted sexual acts, or lewd exhibits exhibition of the genitals. I think that's a very subjective statement, and I don't think the review committee would have agreed with that. And then finally, taken as a whole, lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value as to minors, and I think the committee rejected that notion as well, that taken as a whole, it lacked serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific
So
value.
what do you think would be objectionable for a policy to state a book should be removed? What image? What sexual image would not be okay for you? I'm just curious. Everyone's got a standard. My standard's much lower than yours, obviously. You think my standard's too high?
My standard is looking at the work as a whole.
No, but we're
So-
talking about we're going to talk about the Department of Justice on obscenity laws, which was what you mentioned. What image? So you're saying any image is okay as long as the total sum of it has a literacy standard.
Give me an example.
Okay, I'll give you an example. One student's talking about another student about how they're going to take a dildo and put it in their ass. Does that page, is that okay, or is that too much? And
I
there's
think
graphic pictures of it.
Again, you have to take the thing as a whole.
That's what I'm saying. So what I want to understand is, to you, there is no visual picture that would meet the standard because the overall is strong enough to keep it in.
The standard applies to the work as a whole.
That's fine. So you don't think any picture should be censored from any book in the library, as long as the book is written by an author?
As long as the book
Mr.
is written by an author?
Mr. Saylor.
What the?
Saylor. Mr. Saylor,
Yeah.
respectfully, Dr. Weston's not on trial. We're just having a discussion about boundaries, right?
Oh, so I can't ask questions to the other committee
no,
member?
you can
I-
absolutely
I-
ask
I-
questions, but I think you made your point.
No, I'm trying to
Like
find
I've
out
made my
where.
point.
in
I've made
his
my point.
in his estimation, though, what I heard was that his feeling is that literature shouldn't be censored
At
if
all.
it, and that may be his prerogative.
That's what I'm asking.
But that's what he said.
Well, can I ask him?
Please, and then we're going to move on to somebody else in the group.
Oh, I'll stop.
Mrs. Dorr, if you just hit your microphone that way.
Sorry. Obviously, I'm new to policy committee.
Oh, welcome. Isn't it exciting so
Yeah,
far?
this is lively.
Yeah.
No, I just wondered, we just went through, I guess, policy 815 on the internet policy and the wording. There was words that picked up child pornography, things like that, that
Yep.
would not be allowed to be searched on the internet. So is there some correlation between books that kids are reading and the words they're seeing that they would not be able to then search it on the internet? So
Mrs. Dorr, that's a great point. And actually, to me, that's my biggest point, because we've been talking about 109 for a little bit, and then 815 came back to us from the state. So the contradiction between the two is the thing that I have issue with for myself. But, I was going to get to
I
that.
mean, I'm
so-
okay with the internet
No,
policy.
no,
I don't
no,
want to
yeah.
be
Well,
mislead.
it's two separate lanes,
I
right?
mean,
A library's a library, and the internet's the internet, but then the library's on the internet, and yeah.
And since it was a state sort of recommendation, I
Absolutely.
would think the library would follow that books, but
That's a very good point, and I think we're getting there. Who else did I see?
I think this is
I
a
don't
question.
know if you could just.
Sure. I'm sorry. Erin Pragle, first time at a policy meeting, not my
Welcome.
first time at a board meeting. Thank you. Happy to be here. Question on, you said that provides literary value, or it's a valuable addition. What qualifies a book to be a valuable addition? Is there, right, we can't quantify literature, but what qualifies a book to be a valuable addition to a library? And I would open that up to the entire committee.
I would say that's a judgment that's made by our librarians, our teachers, and our superintendent.
So it's, again, very subjective. There's nothing that says yay or nay. It depends on who's looking at it and what their level of comfort
And
is.
we have people on our district staff, teachers, librarians, education personnel, that are qualified to make that make that judgment. That will look at these materials and say, this particular one, yes. This particular one, not necessarily.
So they're qualified, but what qualifies them to make that judgment call if it's subjective?
They're an educational professional that we've hired to make that judgment.
Again, subjective. Okay, thank you.
Mrs. Lofton.
Judy Lofton. So a couple thoughts, like in response to your question, I just had a flashback to the scene from the Dead Poets Society where Robin Williams is teaching the children about poetry, and they start with a graph of, well, we're going to rate this poem along this graph, and then he says, rip it out. That's not what poetry is about. And I feel the same way about literature. I think it's really incredibly difficult to pin down this is quality literature and this is where we draw the line. And yeah, so I think, it's very difficult. I don't think that it's possible to check those boxes. So, and then also, I think having more stringent rules for our internet access makes sense because of the nature of things that are on the internet. And due to serious problems that exist with child abduction and pornography, that things that are truly exploitive to children need to be very carefully addressed and weeded and pinpointed.
Which is why it makes sense, right, to put the same stringent policies, right, maybe I'm using the wrong term, on literature versus the internet. If we are, policing is the wrong word, if we are coming down more hard on internet and what students can and cannot use the internet for, why would the same lens not apply to something that we're physically putting in their hands?
So, well,
Hold on hold on one second. Go ahead.
but the other point, so Dr. Weston read a definition. What was the definition that you provided?
Okay, the things we were just reading there are taken from policy 815, that's referring to the definition of material that is harmful to minors. From
I like
federal
that
law, and there's a
definition.
similar definition in state law.
I think that's a good definition, and that I don't think that's not the definition that's linked here. And so what I think is problematic about the definition that's linked here is it's specifically about the sexual abuse of children, but it doesn't say anything about naked images of adults. So this policy that's linked here, this is only if the image is of a child. So I like the definition that Dr. Weston provided because I think it's actually a broader and yet more surgical definition of what it is that we should be looking to exclude.
And you can argue that is a subjective judgment based on expertise, which is why I think it's better to have than something that is specifically, prescriptive and could be based on a single image out of an otherwise worthwhile work.
If the librarians don't read all the books in full, because they don't, and it's not if the librarians don't read the books in full, which they don't, because it's not physically possible, they're relying on someone else's expertise when they get the book. So a book comes in, they have sites they look on, they don't read the book. It's not the librarian's fault that some books get into the library that don't belong. So they get a book, Fun Home, as just because we'll use Fun Home because that's the book that I challenged. They don't read Fun Home from top to bottom. They have a review. It comes from a review source. If that review source doesn't tell them what's in the book, no one's blaming the librarian, right? So don't you think having a secondary stopgap prevents some of these books from getting into school districts?
I continue to not really follow what you're getting at here.
Sure. You say it's up to we hire the librarians. It's their expertise. In order to be an expert in something, you need to read it, correct? Would you agree with that? I can't be an expert on that book, The Poet X, unless I read it, correct?
For the sake of the argument, let's follow along, yeah.
Okay. So if I can't be an expert on the Poet X book, I'm relying on the data that's provided to me from the source when I bought that book. I read the 3 or 4 sentences. They said it's a good book. It's in the genre that I want. I can't be an expert on outliers because I haven't read the book in full, right? So when we say that the librarians are experts, I agree, they're librarians. They're well trained for that. But they can't be an expert on every book because they don't read it, right? So they're relying on a source that's not always accurate, providing what's in the book.
So within this policy, excuse me, Dr. Weston, just one second. Under authority, there was a portion that was previously in the policy as a guiding authority for librarians, and then it was stricken. And I do think that it's been recommended now And I agree with the recommendation to reinsert it, and it reads, "The board accepts the School Library Bill of Rights of the American Association of School Librarians as the basis upon which materials shall be selected, approved," and then the revision was weeded within the district. So when you're talking about, please, educators, Dr. Russell, if you could weigh in, the selection process and the authority of and the expertise of a librarian, there is some subjective nature to the interpretation of what that is, but there's also still a standard of professionalism in the selection process.
That is correct. And the School Library Bill of Rights helps provide a level of that guidance, yes.
So, and I understand, Mr. Saylor, and I don't want to paraphrase, you're citing state law and federal law, correct? But we're reviewing this particular policy with regards to the selection of library books for our school district. And you're saying that they should not contradict each other in any way.
No, I didn't say that at all.
Oh, okay, then help us understand what you mean, because I that's what I thought you were saying.
No, I agree with the current adaptation to policy 109, the additions. I agree that there needs to be a form. We need to have a stopgap to what we consider to be not allowed in Perkins Valley School District, and I like what's in there. What I was talking to Dr. Weston about was he mentioned the Department of Justice, so let's go with exactly what they said.
Okay.
Now, I don't agree, and I said this before, I know Rowan has said this, I don't agree with anything the current president of the Library Association of America is saying at all. And, I thought that part should be stricken out, but I don't really care that it's in there. I like the fact that there's a caveat to what we form to be books that aren't suitable. Because, again, the librarians don't read all the books, and we already know that the sites that have been used in the past don't truthfully tell you what's in the books.
They don't get down to the nitty-gritty of every single page.
No. They don't get down to the nitty-gritty of everything. There's a book in our middle school library that has the F word 137 times, has an explicit murder scene in the book. It's a middle school book. It doesn't belong there. The site that says what's about the book doesn't mention that at all. It's not there. And I can't blame the librarian or the superintendent or anyone associated with Perkins Valley because we don't read every single book. And so we're not experts on every book that's in this building.
Point taken. Go ahead, ma'am. If you could just say your name before you...
Oh, there we go. Got it. My first time too here. Debbie Leonetti, Skippack Township. I just wanted to add that when I had heard about some of these questionable books last winter, I did a quick dive into the books on the internet, and it was very easy to find information. I just went to the Barnes & Noble website. A lot of these books are rated over 17. It's very simple. It's right there. To me, if any book is rated on a Barnes & Noble website over 17, it should not be in our library. And it's not difficult to find this information out. So, when a book is challenged, you can very quickly go get that information. A lot of, even on the Barnes & Noble site and some of the other sites that I went down to, they had excerpts from these books. They had visuals, they had descriptions of what's in these books, so it's not that difficult to find information when you've got a questionable book in the library.
So are you suggesting that the language for the selection process be changed in the policy? Because this policy is about every single book. It's not just
Right.
about books that are questionable.
I was just
So
kind
what
of
is
jumping
your-
on what everybody was saying. As far as writing policy, that's way above my,
No, that's why we're
knowledge.
here, though. And listen, there's no right or wrong answers.
Right.
You know.
But there should be something in the policy that says that, again, talking about questionable books, if some books come up for review, that you start, that someone, the librarian or whoever, does a deep dive into it. And like I said, it didn't take me very long to find information on these books.
Right.
A couple seconds, actually.
Sure. So would you think that it would be reasonable to say that maybe in the selection process, maybe 3 sources?
Sure. Yeah,
No,
absolutely.
students have to do a project. They can't just pick one. They have to pick credible sources, right? If maybe three touches or 3 points of... I just picked 3 randomly. I don't know why.
Well, I'm thinking more in the choosing of the books from the librarian's standpoint.
That's
like
what
Mr.
and that's
Saylor.
exactly what I'm talking about. So
Right.
they would have the same standard in selecting books.
Right,
They would have
right.
to go
I gotcha.
through certain criteria.
Right, exactly.
And if
To
it
check off
passes
some
one,
things.
like you said, Barnes and Noble's not. That's a commercial site, right? That's
Right.
not a scholarly journal site, right?
Right, exactly. But I would think that their information, they're dealing with the public.
Understood.
So it's I would say I would trust their information, but then like Mr. Saylor said, if there's other resources that a librarian could go to, use a couple of checkpoints, not just one, but go, like you said, maybe do 3.
And so to that point, that is something that can be incorporated, some sort of, so I don't know if any of the other administrators in the room or any of our teaching staff can speak to the way that they select, for example, curriculum, applicable books in a lesson plan or things like that, that maybe would be heavier, more mature topics, but still have academic content.
Like an AP psychology book.
Yeah, AP Lit. I've read. Do you have something to say? Go ahead.
Jill Hall, Perkiomen, they're Collegeville. Any of the AP class, any of the AP classes are going to have topics that are more advanced. That's why they're called more advanced. Also, just quick note, many of our students in the senior class are over 17, and they are looking for material that takes them to the next level. So while I agree with you that Barnes & Noble might provide you with some valuable information, I don't think that is I don't think that's the right final stop. And I do, if you're going to have 3 people reviewing the books or 3 sources, to me it would make sense to have 2 of them say no to reject, as opposed to searching for 3 and finding one and saying, okay, well, we found our one, we're going to toss that book in the fire. Does that kind of make sense?
I think that's getting a little bit further to where we need to develop something in policy, an admin reg or something, a guiding force. Again, my biggest issue was the contradiction of 815 and 109. And when these, some of these books that were challenged previously, the revisions to 815 were not yet in front of us. They hadn't come down yet.
That's correct. And administration is coming from the same place in its thinking and the recommendation here this evening. This language was not proposed in Policy 815 when we were moving through some of these revisions. And when I read the language and I think about its alignment or misalignment initially to 109, this is a recommendation on the part of administration to more effectively align and keep subjectivity out. So this is why it's come up to the committee this evening.
Did anybody else have anything else to add? So I guess the selection guidelines is really the core of what we're talking about, how books get selected and then how they get, challenged or revisited in terms of the value that they hold. And then the other part of the policy to me, which is perhaps maybe the most important part, are the parental considerations. So I don't know, Dr. Russell, if you feel like there's value in actually reading through those sections and working through some of the language, or how would you like to approach that? I had written a note I don't want to jump all over the place, but I had written a note with regards to the parental considerations, that something should be included along the lines of the district acknowledges that the subjective nature of definitions around appropriate content, and ultimately parents or guardians have the ultimate and final say with regard to what their child has access to. So, I mean, that's at the end of the day, that's what this is kind of all about, and there should be a checks and balances in place. But to say, to grill any one of us as parents as to what we feel is appropriate or not appropriate to our family and our children, it is subjective, and it's impossible to have a one-size-fits-all answer. But, as a parent, I would be comfortable with the checks and balances of maybe 3 sources for selection, and then ultimately opting my child out if I should so choose.
So I appreciate that, and that segues us into the next section, excuse me. So if you look up on the screen, if this is what you're referencing under selection guidelines, so we just talked about the addition of this statement about images. If we scroll down a little bit further, in connection to what some have suggested, that our staff consult a variety of published reviews before selections are made. This is also something that, again, some of the descriptions, as Mr. Saylor pointed out, do not inform our librarians or our staff of everything that might be in a resource material that would raise questions. And we've learned about more resources that we can seek out and access to learn more about some of the books. So that statement was added, to your point. We also want to continue to emphasize our partnership with parents and the responsibility of parents to really know what their children are reading and to be aware that if there's something in our library, we had talked about advertising or making the public aware of books that have been challenged or there have been questions raised about them, so they've moved through that reevaluation process. We've talked about being transparent and helping our community to know that, so that if a parent has a concern, there is currently an admin reg that allows them to opt their child out of signing out that book. So this section around parent considerations is one that I agree with Ms. White. Administration agrees it should be emphasized. Parents play a role in this, and we want them to be our partners in the work.
Yeah, but this is also resource materials now. We're not just talking about the library. I don't want a parent opting themselves out of a math book that they don't like.
Well, that's true. However, maybe we need to look at the actual language that then prompts that opportunity to opt out. That's a good point, because we came back to resource materials, that more broad title. And there's different policy that talks about opting out of curriculum, but you're right. So we should look at the material and see what allows a parent to do that, connected to something like a math book. Because you're right, we don't want them doing that.
Would it be possible to have an opt-in instead of an opt-out for, say, like the books that are being, judged here? Because with all the paperwork and everything, it's more easy for a parent to miss and opt out. Where if their children really wants that book, they would have to come to their parent and be like, "I want this book. You need to sign the opt-in paperwork."
Well, the problem with that is there are thousands of books, right? And so you would have to opt yourself into every single book that's available. Part of the issue with this, going back even before I was on the board, is once it makes it into the library, it's in and it's never rethought of. So, for instance, Fun Home in 2017, the Marner Books, who's the processor of that book, decided to change the fact that the book is now intended for adults, not suitable for children. They made that change in 2017, but the book's been in schools for years. My biggest issue from the get-go is our libraries are not set up by age value. So some students are 17 or 18 and they're older students. Other students are 13 or 14 in ninth grade and they have the same access to an older book, to a book. If you go onto our school's website for the libraries, it tells you what ages books are for. Some books will say suitable for 8th through 12th grade. Some will say suitable for 11th and 12th grade. Some will say 3rd through 7th grade. Well, our school, we're not K to 8 or K to 7 and 8 through 12 like other schools are. And so, that book right there, Girls Can't Hit, is suitable for, hopefully suitable for K through 12, but let's assume it's just suitable for 11th and 12th graders. It's available for everybody. And that's the issue, is the books aren't labeled what age groups the school district thinks they're for. You have to go to the online site to find out what the school district thinks is age appropriate for the child to read, for the student to read.
And I think those labels, they don't come from staff.
No, they don't come from staff. They
publishers.
come from the publishers, correct.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Hi. My name's Allison Kotze, Skip Hack Township. This still doesn't answer the problem where there's books on the shelves that if a parent opts them out, they're still able to take it off the shelf and go in the back corner and read it. So there's things I don't want my daughter seeing, especially Funhouse. Like, hello, I think that's just clear. But these students still have access to these books, so whether we opt them out or not, they're still accessing the books.
So that's a good point. And so that kind of brings, so this is why this type of setup in my mind, which is a little bit unconventional to how we've run policy before, it allows you for us to, now we can talk about this, right? Because in a board meeting, then it's weird and you say your 3 minutes and then you sit down and then we have to just not say anything. Believe me, it's uncomfortable to not respond to people's comments. That point, although this is a policy meeting, Dr. Russell, you can speak now and we can have a conversation about how that concern translates to policy and actually the implementation in the buildings.
You know, and I think it's a very complex, and in some respects, it's a piece of these conversations that's at the heart of the challenge for us. So I don't disagree with the comment that you've made that if a parent opts their child out of a book, they could still pull it off the shelf, sit down in one of our comfy chairs and read it during a study hall. That's true, they could. What we hope is that there are conversations happening between students and their parents. We hope that students feel comfortable asking questions of their teachers if they need guidance on a book that's just right for them, as we phrase it. But there are some things that we just can't control, and under the laws currently, are not controlled in a library. So some of this is a partnership between us and parents, the relationship we have with our students so that they make the best choices for themselves. And sometimes that does happen, and there's a book that an individual student might pick up that a parent would not agree with that they pick up. And there's some way we can influence that, but it's not a perfect science.
Okay. So yes, there's a conversation that needs to happen between parents and children, and I think that's a huge problem of where these policies are going wrong is because the schools are trying to take over the parents' responsibilities because some parents don't actually parent. However, that we're here because we have kids and we care about them and we love them, and we know that they're not going, if they see something that you tell them not to do, it doesn't mean they're not going to do it because you've had this conversation with them. But as parents, it's our job to protect them as much as we can. When I send my kid to school, I expect this to be a controlled environment where I don't have to worry about her looking at pornographic images in her library. So it's very, it's a very emotional topic because I'm just blown away that we even have to have this conversation. It's a public school. If you have older students that really want to look at these books, there's a public library.
I'm so sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you at all. Would you be able to just find a seat at any table? You're welcome to.
She's in front of the camera.
You're in front of the camera, that's the only, yep. Oh, pull up a chair on the end or what, yeah. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize you were, I'm so sorry. So, Ms. Katze, so your point and your feelings, they've been heard all along throughout the whole process. From my years anyway, I can only speak for myself. However, I will say that that's the only thing that a school district has as a guiding force are policies. And so during this committee, the idea in having a collaborative, open community dialogue is to allow for development that suits everyone, not just a one-size-fits-all. So that goes back to what language would make you comfortable within the policy that would make you feel as though there was, and that's rhetorical. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but that's the type of conversation that we need to get to at the policy committee level. What language do you want to see show up here? And then let's talk about it.
Well, basically, if you have a school full of students that are the majority are under 18. I don't think that we should be talking about bringing any books in here just to fit the students that are 18. I think that if they need those books that bad, they can go to the public library or online and get them. But why are we putting other children, the minors, in danger of coming across these books that are completely inappropriate?
Understood.
I'm sorry, if they want that book that bad, go to the library.
Absolutely understood. So what language can we put in place? And that's just a broad question. Mrs. Rudolph, I saw you raise your hand.
Hi, Donna Rudolph, Laura Frederick. One of the questions I had about the opt-out process is that the parents don't know, like that would be geared toward a specific book if you're aware of it, like Fun Home. But if you don't know what all is in the library, you can't successfully opt your kid out. Even if your kid is going to listen to you and the kid doesn't want the book and you don't want them to read the book, you don't know what's in the library because you have no way of knowing what all of these books are, so you can't even opt them out. until they become identified. Then okay, fun homes in the library. Okay, let me opt my kid out of that. But we don't know. We just want to be able to send our kids to school and, believe that they're reading appropriate books. And I understand that there are students that want other books, but I feel like there should be some kind of way for those students to access those books, but not everybody. So maybe that could be looked at too, where they're still available for other kids, but not the general population. So
Go ahead.
that's
Go ahead, ma'am.
two
I
things.
just say your name.
Yeah, my name is Rebecca Johnson. I'm Shrinksville. I'm just agreeing with them because I agree. I like the Barnes and Noble idea, like the rating thing. The thing is that when there's such a push, like when we were talking about putting like what schools belong in the school library versus like a public library. Like a public library, you can have any kind of book in there. Barnes and Noble, Books A Million, whatever, you can have whatever book you want in there. But when we're talking about a school library, like when I send my children to school, I have 4 children of all different kind of ages. Like I want to make sure that those are school appropriate books. Like I don't want to feel like my children are going to be reading a book that's absolutely literally out of control. And like, these are not like, when, people say, well, moms are trying to like ban books. We're not trying to ban books. Like I'm a therapist and I see children of all different ages, and I have like several teenage girls. They, different parents parent different ways. And I have this one particular teenage girl, her parents much differently than I do. And she has books that, I would not allow my daughter to read. And she does not get them at our library, thankfully, but she gets them through Barnes and Noble. They are accessible to her. Like her mom lets her read them. That's great. So it's not like these books are not accessible to these children. Like they can get them however they want them. But like I don't want to feel like there's enough stuff going on out there. Like I want to be able to send my children to a public school and feel like they're not going to be pulling books off there and getting pornography. So I was just agreeing, like, yes, I feel like the Barnes and Noble rating, I feel like that's very appropriate. Yes, we do have 18-year-olds in this school, but this is still a public school. We do not need to cater to the few 18-year-olds. They have access. It's not like they don't have access to older opportunities. They can get older stuff.
Okay. Thank you, Mrs. McGee. And then we'll just wrap up then.
Shona McGee, Skipback Township. Is there a way that books like Fun Home could be like behind the desk so that only 18-year-olds or 17 plus, whatever the age category, if they're for 17-year-olds and over, that only they can access them?
So that's a question for administration and also both obviously Dr. Russell, but also high school administration. There's some staff here as well that I'd like to hear their opinion. The message with regards to what's appropriate is loud and clear. We've been having that conversation obviously in the public and board comment, and we've gone on with regard to the point of view there. And there's no question that there are concerns that are valid and really appropriate for a school setting. That being said, we need to then codify that desire to protect in a way that works for everyone in a public school setting through policy. So the things that we can add in policy would be things like the selection criteria. Yes. We could add, if a book falls into XYZ criteria, then it goes into a professional stack, or it goes into like the video store, like behind the curtain type of thing. Right? We're all of that age, right? Where we remember that. What'd you say? There you go. Right, or you're at the stationery store and the magazines that are sort of behind the register. So those types of things, that language can be put in policy, and then it has to be followed. But the complaint is heard. The concern is heard, right? You hear it. I agree. Okay. So I don't know, in terms of like, are students at the high school like sneaking down to the library to sit behind the stack and read through Fun Home? I just, is that happening, Mr. Marsh? I don't, have you,
You're asking me if
caught
students are
a whole bunch of
here
people?
and sneaking books off the shelf and reading them? I have no
Yeah,
idea.
right.
I'll just offer this. Having had the opportunity to listen to this conversation evolve through policy committee and in the public for the past several months, and in my role at the high school and in my role in this district, traditionally, I'll just say this, that the idea of, as I've been trained in many venues, the idea of having a several-pronged check of reputable sources to serve as a validation for a resource, in this case, we're talking library books, is a very reasonable and sustained thing, in my opinion, to do that. I don't know, and I don't want to speak for the librarians. I've never been a librarian. I don't know that that cuts into their autonomy or their selection process or their professionalism, which we value very much, too much of a degree. It matches in a lot of ways, and some folks in the room may correct me, but I'm historian by training originally, matches in a lot of ways getting multiple reputable sources that you can line up and see the commonalities. I would love to see, as an administrator, it would be great to see this committee then start to wrestle with that language about what that would be or what those check boxes would be, because I think that's moving along the lines. To the concern about students getting things off of the shelf without their parents knowing, the concern that was shared here, without them knowing, I hesitate. I mean, I really don't want to speak and say, well, I believe this is appropriate. I have done no research or talking to anybody here about what would that look like if we put books behind the shelves and we signed them out and we had 18-year-olds, and what would that procedure look like, and how, and I don't know what the law would be. Does that on the surface seem like a rational solution? I suppose. I would have to see how many 18-year-olds, right? I wanted to see circulation numbers. I want to see what's being signed out. But I think it's procedurally how you do that so you don't lose the access for kids who, if this group and the board decides certain students at certain levels should have access to certain things, then they still need to have access to them. So we have to have procedures where they can get them. Sorry to ramble there a little bit at the end.
The only thing I'll share is that I echo Mr. Marsh's comment about this. If the committee recommends the selection criteria and maybe considering 3 valid sources that help us to review books and know more about them before we would recommend purchasing them, I'd like to talk to librarians. They do have a professional library, and they do most often have teacher resources in that professional library. However, there have been occasions when they have put books in the library that they've realized years ago, these are not the best books or best suited for our students. So there are some things I think we can talk about and explore further with our librarians, but it's really important to bring them into the conversation.
I see 2 hands here, and that, go ahead.
Just real quickly, I think at a previous board meeting, this whole issue of students looking at books or checking these actual books out has been made that there's not that many kids at all that are looking at these books. So my point would be, why are we letting them burn a hole on the shelves of this library if they're not even being utilized? My second point is,
That could be said about every book here, I suppose.
True, right? Because, everything's online now.
For sure.
I get it. But my second point is, as a concerned parent, not in this district, but a member of the community who pays taxes and is, paying for this, okay, out of my taxes, has anyone looked at what academic pluses to having this type of material in a library actually afforded to the kids?
Right.
Like, what
That
are
goes
the
back to the
stats? What are
subjectivity
what are the-
conversation,
what
right?
are the- I want to see studies on how this affects young children that are not of age, that shouldn't be looking at this type of thing. That's all. As a taxpayer, I don't want my money going for something that's not an effective tool
Understood.
or resource for our children.
So to that point, and I think that's valuable, it is subjective. Mr. Cleland, I hate to put you on the spot, but I will anyway. As a teacher who structures, as a literature teacher, who structures lessons around obviously established curriculum materials. Sometimes curriculum within different levels of ELA would be more challenging, or it would have maybe not subjective, not in the same pornographic way, but content that would maybe be more mature. Can you talk about some of the books that are on like the quote unquote hit list, if they would be part of your selection in terms of introducing it into the classroom? Can you talk about the value that you see and how you determine that?
I don't think we're talking about using these in the classroom.
No, we're not. But I just wanted to kind of to marry the thought process around. We're not talking about using them in the classroom. So, but I want to marry the thought process around what the educational value could potentially be in some of these works.
I mean, every book in the library is there so that if a student wants to pursue an interest, there's something there for them to do that. And it's very individualized. I mean, as a teacher, I certainly teach the students how to select the best book for them that reflects their values, values that we as parents put there. And they've been doing great with it for many, many years. I mean, since the conversation came up, however long ago we started this, I've certainly started putting emphasis with my students on researching a potential book that they're about to read online, find out what's in it, make sure they know what they're getting into. And I mean, the best part about books is once they get to something that does not align with their values, they close the book and that experience ends. They put it back on the shelf. I don't know that we can hide our children from what we consider inappropriate books any more than we can hide them from what we consider to be inappropriate people. But we just teach them to honor their values that their parents gave them. So I haven't seen a problem with the students. I've never seen students sneak down to read books, but that would be a good problem to have. So I don't know if I answered your question, but we're.
Yeah, you did, only in the sense that you've made similar comments before, and you know, I guess my personal feeling is that there's value to your point, either positive or negative. It could have negative value. You could see something that you find objectionable in a book and say, oh my God, I don't want to ever do that, know that, deal with that. Mrs. Mayers?
So I just want to discuss what was just said. So as parents, there's a lot of talk about it's the parent values. So some of what I'm hearing is it's also teacher guidance is one thing, and I have no problem with teacher guidance, and I respect that, and that's why we send our children to school, to also get different opinions and voices. But the issue is that there are books available to our students, to our minor students, that qualify as pornography if you look at the Pennsylvania statutes. And that's the issue. So if we didn't have books that would qualify as pornographic under Pennsylvania state law or statute or this Department of Justice definition, I would have no problem with what Mr. Clellan just said, and I respect you. So it's not you. The issue is what is available to our students. And
so, Mrs. Mayers, you're familiar with the policy process, obviously. So what language would you like to see incorporated from the committee to reflect that?
Well, I've asked for this for many, many months. I think it makes sense, instead of arguing about the language, that we use already established law, Pennsylvania state law, Pennsylvania statutes that are very specific about the definition of pornography. And because as a legislative body, that's already been decided, and as a society, we have decided that there are some things that minors should be protected from. So that would be what I would ask for.
Dr. Russell.
So I think I can give an opinion on that, but I'd like to allow any other comments first. And then I think what I'd like to do is broaden the position of administration and just libraries in general in response to some of the comments. But these are very helpful. So Jill, if you want to share.
So first, I kind of like the idea, and in fact, I think I mentioned it a long time ago at one of the meetings, about having a separate section for those books that some folks might find objectionable. As far as pulling books from the library and sending students of any type, any age, to the public library for their resources, the truth of the matter is this is a public school system. We are supposed to meet their needs within our walls. And yes, they have the library to go to, but not all of those students have access to a car. Some of them are working jobs, some of them are playing sports, some of them are involved in other things or not in family situations that afford them the opportunity outside of the school building to go do those things. So I understand your point, but pulling them completely out of the school district, I don't think that's the right answer. I think that is taking resources from students who are not as privileged as many of those who have the freedom to get to other places to do their research. So again, I think there are, I'm not an extremist here. I'm not trying to be an extremist. I'm trying to make sure that we don't overcorrect, because once we start pulling books, it's a real slippery slope and it goes downhill fast.
Okay, so, all right, hold on.
You want to pause?
Yeah, let me pause, because I had.
Janice Sheridan, Skippack Township. I was just curious. I think we've discussed this for so long, and yet none of us really knows what benefit these books that we're talking about have in this library, what benefit they are to our children. If they are a benefit to a small group and you don't want to take them out because they benefit a small group, then I will go back to a suggestion months ago when they said they should be in an area locked up where a librarian has to allow the book to be taken, and the parents should opt in. They just get a little ID card, or they get a library card that has a little code on it. It doesn't have to be, and then they can get the books. But it would keep other children, like ours, all of those other issues that you had, reading in a corner and all that, would be, I mean, they're still in the library. And I don't understand what the objection was to that.
So I don't know that they're necessary. I think some of it was feasibility, and that can be further explored and discussed. But with regards to the language of 109, I would like to try to get to a place that we can come up with a solid plan for the selection process, because as Mr. Saylor had pointed out, many times, and then tonight as well, there's so many books that people don't even know what's in them to begin with. So there's going to be like a lag time almost. It's almost like a book can't get highlighted and spotlighted for what the value is until it's challenged, right? And challenging books requires time and effort with regards to resources. Go ahead.
I think we're going in circles. We have a policy. We're supposed to develop the policy. It's clearly that the majority in the room agree that we need to have a policy that sets standards. I did make a motion months back to set standards for elementary school, middle school, and high school that the board didn't want to go with, or thought it was too stringent. But we you can't set standards. This is the most important room in the school, because in today's society, when everything's on a phone and everything's on a computer, kids don't pick up books, smell the book pages, and read them. this is a really important room. My personal belief is that this room should enable all students, whether their race, their ethnic background, their income level, whatever the story is, there should be something in here that represents everybody, except we don't need to have foul language. We don't need to have picture books that don't create real value and don't lead to a moral society. But it should be there should be books there for every single student, and we don't necessarily have that. There's one book in this library, one that talks about being a plumber, right? And when we talk about ready for the workforce and schools after that kids are going to go to college, our libraries aren't, it's not just Perkiomen Valley Library, it's libraries in general, school libraries. If you listen to the words of the new president of the American Library Association, she, quote unquote, I want to create a Marxist society library for all young students. Those were her words, not mine. That's what worries people like myself and parents that have that same worry. I want to create a library that touches every single student in our school district, that makes rooms like this really important, but has a standard of civility in that, right? I don't curse on, when I'm at work. I don't curse in normal conversation. I don't think students, regardless of their age, should be reading that, and I don't think there should be pictures that are sexual in nature unless it's in the educational setting. Educational setting means it's in the classroom, not in the library for free to pick up. But we could do this all night long without talking about the policy.
That's noted, and so I keep drawing it back to the policy, obviously. But we have a lot of folks that are new to policy, and honestly, this is the most productive and respectful conversation we've had in a long time. So I want to just say thank you for everybody feeling that they have the ability to voice their opinions and actually dialogue with us, because again, that's something that we need to just move on and move past all of that. So going back to the policy, we need then language. Did that come back, your thought? I did. Is it different, or is it the same thought that came back? No, go ahead. Hit the microphone.
Okay, so so what I was gonna say was, we were talking about a lot of people were talking about, like, is there any research or anything like that? So there's actually been a ton of research. Like, we know that there's a lot of research about, what is valuable for children. There's actually no value for children for them to be exposed to sexualized material. Literally there's no value to it. Like, it doesn't make them healthier people. It doesn't give them healthier relationships. There's no value to them being exposed to sexualized material. Zero. Which is why it's considered, it's why it's literally like 5 years ago, I'm a mandated reporter, and many of you are too. 5 years ago, these books, a lot of them would have, if I had a parent providing this material to these children, I would have been like, we need to have a discussion about this. So it's really crazy to kind of see the landscape and to see how it's changed. But a lot of it's interesting why why this push is so hard to be like, we need to have this in our school library. It's bad enough that it's in our libraries, but I don't really understand why it needs to be in our public school library. But we literally have the research. It's out there. It's been out there. It's been out there for a very long time. It blurs the boundaries of children's minds. It changes their synapses. It changes their ideas about relationships. It blurs the boundaries of understanding between adults and children. And I'll kind of finish it with this. The other day, a couple weeks ago, Ellie, my almost 18-year-old, was sitting with me, and we were listening to some school board speech. And this man was talking about a book that was in his middle school, and read it. And the school board was like, no, because it was extraordinarily offensive. And I was like, oh my gosh. And Ellie goes, oh, we had to read that book. She's a senior at PV. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, we had to read that book. I think it was in 7th grade. She went to PV Middle School West. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, yeah, we had to read that. I don't think anyone read it though. And I'm like, holy crap, I'm glad you didn't read it, but you were assigned this book? She said, yes, we were assigned this book. This is not this is not adding, it's not Tom Sawyer. These are not great literature works that we're talking about here. Like, no one's trying to take away good literature. We're talking about, and they trust and believe they will find this stuff if they want it. They just don't need it at our school, our public school library. Like, they will find it. But like, especially in a culture where it is pushing hookup culture and things like that, like that, and that is not healthy for them either. Trust and believe that. But they will find these things. But we do not need to be pushing that and pushing a value system. Like, we need, once upon a time, school was neutral. And the home was where, if you want to push hookup culture in your home, then by all means, that's fine. But that's where you, at home, you can push those things or not push them. But like that's needs to be reserved for your home life.
All right. I think
So,
point
like, I have an
point
idea.
taken. Point taken.
You know, we start at elementary school level. We could, like, do you believe that in elementary school level, no library book should have curse words?
So are you looking for criteria within the selection, Mr. Saylor?
Yeah.
Are you looking for criteria within
Yeah, you
the
said you wanna,
selection
like,
process?
build wording and
Okay,
possibly,
so
like,
so
if we just
let's
started with
shift to that, because I think the point's been made. Like you said, everybody's had a say, and I don't know that anybody's opinion changed. But go ahead. Go ahead, and then we're going to move on to language.
It's not an opinion, just two suggestions possibly for policy.
Perfect.
Is one, to have a mental health professional be part of that review board, somebody who's qualified and has that child development specialty on that review board. The other part is that I absolutely believe that we need to incorporate the language from federal and state law on pornographic material. If it has anything, I don't care what it contributes to the book as a whole, if it has a pornographic image in it, that book should be gone. So if we follow the state and federal law, and then we have a mental health professional reviewing, I think that we'd be in a much better place.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And so, to Mr. Saylor's point, if we can go back to the selection guideline language.
No, I was just, you're not going to get it all done because you're not going to
Correct,
get everyone
correct.
to agree, but I'm just curious. Elementary school, do we think books in the library should have curse words? And I'm talking about George Carlin curse words.
Yeah, so I don't know what George Carlin curse words are, but
It's
think
a great, I have the record,
Yeah,
I can show it.
and I haven't listened to it, so
You have a record
maybe I
player?
should. No, actually, I don't. But
I do.
maybe I should seek that out just to be able
It has
to
about
understand.
11 words that you'll
So-
know don't belong in elementary school.
Okay, so I do appreciate the reference. Here's what I'm wondering about. I think there's been some really helpful feedback tonight, and again, Mr. Saylor mentioned, some others mentioned, the library is designed so that students can seek out books that support their interests, their gifts, wanting to learn and see themselves. That's really our goal in the library. The efforts on the part of administration are to zero in on some things that are in a concrete manner and aligned to Policy 815, viewed as inappropriate for students. I think some of the suggestions tonight, Ms. White, if you're comfortable, are ones that I'd like to take back to our librarians and have some conversation with. I think the idea that we tap 3 references, for example, in selection guideline number 8 is very reasonable. I'd like to talk to our librarians about this and come back next month and report out. But I feel as if we've made some forward progress. This idea that books that are reevaluated and raise questions for some are ones that I wonder more about putting into a professional library. We talked about that, and we went back and forth with separating books and making kids come to the desk and ask the librarian for a particular book. That's come up a few times tonight, though, and I'd like to talk to our librarians about it and then come back to you and report back if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I do. I think that's a good direction. And I don't know if anybody else has anything else that they would like to see codified in Policy 109 that hasn't been said. I know that we received some emails with regards to some language. I don't know if anybody else has anything that they'd like to add in order for administration to review, consider, and then come back so we can continue this conversation. And again, I absolutely, this has gone really in a really healthy and very whole way. So I really appreciate everybody's willingness to voice their opinions respectfully. But if we can put a pin in 109?
Yeah, I didn't know Mrs. Watkins. No. Okay.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, if we could we could, yeah, let's move on, because I know that, I think we're.
Is everybody on the committee comfortable with that?
Yes, can I just go back to 8:15 1 second? I have a question. Question. When students are in the building, are they able to connect to the school Wi-Fi
Yes, they can use the Bring Your Own Device network.
on their phone?
Yes.
So, for instance, if policy 815 passes, will Snapchat and TikTok be banned from being accessed on our Wi-Fi?
Yes, Snapchat, TikTok, and all those other platforms are banned on our network, yes.
And they would be banned on the computers then as well?
That is correct, on the Chromebooks, yes.
Thank you so much. That's awesome.
Thank you, Mr. Saylor. Go ahead. Did you have something else, Mrs. Lofton, before we move on? But with regards to what the district is monitoring, the district Wi-Fi is going to. Okay. Understood.
I was thinking that, Mrs. Lofton, but didn't want to add it. Our students are very savvy.
Mrs.
They,
Lofton's always
Yes, but
connecting
they're-
the dots to
She
have
is.
another level of
They-
conversation
There's a
about
big
it.
difference. There's a
They
big
keep
difference
us on
there.
our toes.
There's a big difference there. They're no longer getting access to those pages on our dime. They're using their parents' data center. And there actually was a school district in Ohio last week that removed, in the middle school and elementary school settings, they removed all their mirrors from their bathrooms because they found out that their students were going to the bathrooms and doing TikTok videos and losing eight minutes a day of educational resources.
Wow.
And since they removed mirrors from the bathrooms, and they actually now no longer let students, when a student leaves to go to the bathroom, they have to show their phone and put it down before they leave. They've reduced that influx, and I thought it's a great idea by that school district.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's like a Disney World mentality of not having mirrors in the bathrooms to keep people moving. I don't know how everybody's familiar with that, but that's what that makes me think of. That's actually really smart.
I like it.
Yeah. All right. So, squirrel. Okay. So where are we? 201, admission of students, yeah?
Right. So, relatively quickly, this policy also initially went to a first reading to the board and was suggested to come back to policy committee. As we think about right now, we're in the thick of kindergarten registration and implementing full-day kindergarten. There has been some question about our cutoff date for when students need to be 5. Administration feels strongly it should be September 1st. They need to be 5 on or before September 1st. And really just to give the new board members serving on this committee and the committee an opportunity to raise a question or share a comment, if there are any, this would be the time to do that. What this policy language does is eliminates early entrance possibilities. We believe as an administrative team with the input from our school psychologists that that serves the best interests of our incoming kindergarten students.
So I guess my comment, we did receive some email correspondence with regards to the age limit. I guess my only question would really be for students that demonstrate exceptionality, how those students are then afforded an opportunity, other than having to go to a full-time kindergarten program outside of the school district, how they're afforded educational opportunity.
And that's a good question, and I'm certain others have it. What we do as a district is we assess where our students are that are presenting as high achievers or as gifted learners, and we support them. We meet them where they are. So if they're in 2nd grade and need a 5th grade math class, we've provided it. If they're in 5th grade and need a middle school level math class, we've provided that. If they're in middle school and are ready for high school science and math, and have demonstrated through evidence and data that they're ready, we provide that. So we have lots of ways that we analyze and assess students for where they are as learners, what they need, and what we can provide them. And we make every effort to do that for our highest achievers.
So I guess then, not if they're 4. And I'm not trying to be cheeky about it, but.
Understood. However, even if they're 4 or 5, and there is serious concern, our principals can speak to this about stamina, and we're hearing from other school districts that this is hard for our youngest learners to come in and make it through a full day of school. It's hard for adults when we start the school year, I'll be very honest. However, we're worried about that, and we want to set them up for success. And once they come in, as 5-year-olds, if they are ready for more, or something that moves faster, or something at a higher level, We work to provide it and support them. So there is that elimination of, if a child is 4 and passes the tests and is ready, we are now saying we don't recommend that as something that's in the best interest of the child at that age. But as they progress, we support acceleration, we support compacting, we support enriching, all of that.
Does anyone have any? I'll open the floor. Go ahead.
Any consideration given also to the maturity level, right, of those that are younger too? So outside of, outstanding educational abilities, there's a big difference between a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old in terms of socialization also.
I would agree with that. I think the only comment I have with regards to that is that you may have a more mature 4-year-old than a 6-year-old. So it's tough, and I don't disagree with you about appropriateness and things like that. And listen, the stamina is a huge piece of it. I know that was a big conversation that I had with a lot of folks about going from half day to full day. It's a shift in mentality. We have an elementary principal. I would love to hear from you.
2 of them.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see you there. But the idea about that's why I say if there's a mature 4-year-old that is truly ready, I think the hang up that I have is the calendar being the thing that stands in the way. And if I'm the parent of that 4-year-old, I would then seek other enrichment, and then you're outpaced with, now you have a child that had a program as a 4-year-old, now they're coming in and first grade, now they're out of sync with their track of learning.
And so I say all that in support of the cutoff at 5 years old.
And so
not
that's
going
why
before
you're in support of it.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Is that because there's no way to measure that socialization and the maturity aspect. And let's be clear, by the time they get into kindergarten, first, second grade, that likely evens out for most, right?
By the middle of elementary school, I would agree with that. Yeah,
Right,
for sure.
right.
I don't know if either Ms. Venza or if you'd like to speak to it.
I agree with what was said already. I think it's really difficult to establish maturity in, like, how would we determine that? And there could be mature 3-year-olds too. So, like, it's very difficult to determine that. But I do agree with what Dr. Russell said. And there's always going to be someone that is going to be at that cutoff, and no matter what date or age you do cut it off at. But maybe Mrs. Franciosa, I don't know if you want to jump in, but we just find that some of our younger children, it's just really difficult for them to, stamina-wise, to keep up.
What is the date that you choose, and then how do you really establish that criteria for maturity? But I think more importantly, it goes to what Dr. Russell said. So if a student has some exceptionalities, if they arrive at school when they're 5, we're going to meet those needs. So even if they turn 5 on September 2nd, that following year when they start, those exceptionalities will still be present, and we're going to understand them and work with the student, work with the teachers, work with all the interventionists in the building to figure out how do we best support that student. And so I think time and time again, you see that our youngest learners often struggle, just maybe not academically, but sometimes with the social piece. And you may not see it at 5 and 6 years old when they're still playing with Legos and they're all doing the same thing, but as those years go on, you see that social gap, and that's emotionally is really tricky for kids to handle with the friendships. So I really am grateful that we're considering this, and the board is considering this as an option to really best support our students, especially as we move into full day kindergarten, which we're very excited about. So I think there's just a lot to consider, and I think this policy really best supports our students and their ability to really grow and flourish, not just as 5-year-olds, but as middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Thank you both, honestly. And I wanted to have the conversation and bring that up as a devil's advocate point, because it was something that was brought to us. I do support the recommendation for all of the reasons. I mean, truly, this is what we need you for, right? So, you know, I don't have an issue with it in general, but I wanted it to be clear and on the record that these were the thought process around recommending it. Thank you.
And I think that's really helpful to the community too. So I
Yeah,
appreciate
it was
you
really,
taking the
that was,
time,
yep.
to do that.
Does anybody have anything else on that? Okay, so we're moving then to 720, use of restroom and locker room, Dr. Russell.
All right, so last but not least, so lots of discussions been happening around the use of restrooms in our schools. And initially, administration, I've mentioned this in public, was not aware of an issue or a challenge around gender identity students using restrooms that align to their transgender students using restrooms that align to their gender identity as opposed to biological sex. This has raised questions for some. Administration was not aware of concerns or challenges and had been accommodating under the authority vested in Policy 103 in the very few cases where students requested this accommodation or benefited from it. So there have been lots of questions about Policy 720 and the need for Policy 720. I don't believe we need a Policy 720. What I am suggesting in an effort to be transparent is an administrative reg connected to Policy 103 that informs individuals who have questions about or are viewing the world as transgenders, living the world as transgenders, what it is we support in our schools and how we uphold what's in Policy 103. So Policy 720 is listed here on the agenda for discussion. It came up at a most recent board meeting, as is an AR, an administrative regulation, which really is something that's developed truly by the administration and helps us all to understand how to uphold policy. It doesn't have the teeth of policy, if you will, but it does guide administration, and we are held accountable to administrative regulations. So I am suggesting for committee conversation and consideration an administrative reg policy to Policy 103. We call it 103 AR2. And this is the language there that defines some of the terminology we use and reference when we talk about transgender students, as well as we've come upon some issues with student records, so it's helpful to incorporate a piece about student records and how we document students or change names in the system, and then restroom accessibility. So this administrative reg is being presented with that background and bringing us up to where we are in this debate and this conversation for the purpose of hopefully being able to meet the needs of all students and help others to understand how we approach that.
Can I ask you a question? 103 is about Title IX, correct?
Non-discrimination, yeah. Discrimination in Title IX, yes.
Title IX. Most of the vernacular in Policy 103 is about Title IX.
I don't know if I could say that without looking at it. I'd need to reference it to say that it's actually aligned.
Board declares policy of the district to comply with federal law and regulations under Title IX.
So 103 does cover non-discrimination. While 103 does have a focus on Title IX, it covers overall non-discrimination and harassment.
Correct. Does Title IX currently recognize gender identity or gender dysphoria?
I think we've been through this, and Mr. Keenan has advised us as well. Title IX currently has guidelines.
Guidelines, but not...
They are not law yet.
Correct, not law.
That's correct.
Correct. And
Still being evaluated.
When we do accommodations at Perkiomen Valley, like for instance ADHD or any other accommodations, they're with like a counselor, a school counselor, or a medical diagnosis from a medical practitioner, correct? Like ADHD is a medical diagnosis. A parent just can't say, my kid has ADHD, and we're going to say we'll throw all types of accommodations unless we're going to put that child through some form of an IEP, some form of sitting with a counselor, or they're coming back with some medical information. When you're talking about opening up Policy 103 to your admin regulation, which doesn't talk about locker room facilities. It doesn't talk about PIAA sports when you've stated on record that 103 allows the building principal to assign a student to a sport that goes with their gender identification or a locker room with their gender identification. Would there be any other accommodation in the school district, save transgenderism, where we don't have a medical or a counselor saying that the student has that accommodational need?
So let me back up. It's PIAA that governs which team transgenders play on by saying the principal selects that. The principal identifies it. So it's not policy, it's not Title IX, it's not Dr. Russell. It's actually the PIAA bylaws that state it's the principal who decides which team a transgender student
And
can
only
compete on.
because 103 is in its current format does Perkins Valley allow the principal to make that decision.
No, PIAA states it.
Not if it didn't say gender identification in policy 103, it wouldn't be allowable.
So I'd like to bring that forward the next time, the language from PIAA.
So my first question is there any other accommodation in our school district that doesn't come with a medical diagnosis and or a counselor's diagnosis?
Yes, a 504 does not require a medical diagnosis or a note from a doctor. It doesn't require it under the law.
So a 504, for example, for what?
That's Americans with Disabilities
Any
Act.
accommodation.
Any disability that impacts a
You're allowed
life
to chew
activity.
gum. You're allowed to chew gum. You're allowed to color after
Eat a
tests.
snack,
Right.
middle of the day.
Documented with, and we have to
Does
hold
every
up.
student that has a 504 meet with a counselor
No.
or
I
meet
mean,
with a program?
Initially, for an assessment, yes.
Is an
right?
assessment's done?
Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a counselor. I'm looking to Mr. Marsh because if I don't want to speak in generalities if there are specifics, because Mr. Saylor, I know you like specifics, so I want to be accurate here, so I'm looking to Mr. Marsh.
Yeah, gladly. 504s are managed by the counselors, so you are guaranteed at least one time a year to meet with a counselor in the 504 because they, for lack of a better term, quarterback that process with a team. Practically, the counselors do meet with their they meet with all their students every year. You know what I mean? So, but practically, and then as needed, they would meet with them. But to answer your specific question, yeah, they meet with their counselor because their counselor manages the 504.
But the question was, do they assess students to qualify for a 504? They do not assess the
Correct.
students
Correct.
to qualify for a 504.
But they meet.
How many 504s have you issued to use bathrooms of the opposite sex?
So that's a pointed question, and that is something, Mr. Keenan, that I brought up the other day with regards to the language and 504 accommodations. There is really nothing stopping any parent in the district, in any public school, in the United States of America from saying that they want their child to use a separate bathroom every time they use the bathroom. That would, if I understand correctly what a 504's purpose is, it's within reason if the school can accommodate that has to be accommodated.
Correct, but we have singular use bathrooms unlike other
So-
school districts.
so
So that
but-
accommodation is you have access to the single use bathroom. What we're saying now with this new AR is you can use whatever bathroom you feel comfortable
So
in regardless
I
of
use
the
that
other
as an
student
example,
body.
Mr. Saylor, in the sense that a parent can ask for that
Yeah.
hypothetically. A parent can also then ask and say, with that same reasoning, this is my child, this is my male child. I want them to be able to use the men's room.
That's not what the law says.
Well, that's not what your interpretation of the law says. And so that's why I think we have to have a conversation with regards to where we want to get with the AR versus, 720. Mrs. Lofton?
So my understanding of 504s is they are specifically for students who have disabilities and therefore need some sort of an accommodation as a result of their disability. And so I guess to me it's a little odd to suggest that this is an accommodation for a disability because I don't consider somebody's gender identity to be a disability.
I would wholeheartedly agree with you, Mrs. Lofton.
The
just
law
for the
would
record.
disagree, though.
Hold on
Gender
hold on
dysphoria
one
is a
second,
recognized-
Hold on one second,
is a
Mr.
recognized-
Hold on one second, Mr. Saylor. Please, thank you. I appreciate you holding on 1 second until I finish my thought. I wholeheartedly agree with you. And in the conversation that I candidly had with Dr. Russell, what I had said in the dialogue that we had was what is stopping a parent from loopholing and assigning their child a 504 to allow for that type of accommodation. Her answer was really nothing. But in the next sentence I said, that would have to force then that parent and child to label their child as having a deficiency of some sort. And I absolutely agree with you that that is not appropriate, and that is not at all what I'm implying or insinuating. But with regards to the black and white written law that Mr. Saylor keeps referencing, Mr. Keenan, did you have something to offer?
Oh, I just want.
You want to just hit the microphone?
Yeah, so it'd be nice if my, diabetic child could choose not to be diabetic, I mean, that'd be wonderful. That'd be great. Could you fix that for me?
So I don't know if you do have a diabetic child, but
if we could just
is
deny
that
that these mental illnesses exist and these physical illnesses
well,
exist,
diabetes
I mean,
is not
that
a
would be
mental.
great.
So we've had a great night so far. I think the entire room can agree. So do you have a point to what you're saying? If you do have a
504,
point,
I mean, is there something wrong or morally wrong because my daughter has a 504?
of course not.
Thank you. That makes my point.
If that's your
That
point,
undermines your point.
it does not undermine my point.
It absolutely does. There is nothing morally wrong with having a mental illness.
That is not what I said. That I didn't say that there was anything wrong with having a 504. What I was getting at, and what I think Mrs. Lofton's point was, is that just like you are a man, and I am a woman, and you are a woman, and whatever your identity is, you don't have to codify that with documentation. And so therefore, those individuals that are transgender should not have to either. And I think that's what Mrs.
Right.
Lofton's point
And
was.
no,
That
if
has
I can
nothing to
finish
do
my
with the
the
disease.
point that I was trying to make. So, and just for clarification, one of my children did have a 504 for many years due to a medical condition that we provided the school with extensive documentation about his medical issues. So, I'm certainly do not mean anything negative to people who have a medical issue. I'm saying that I don't believe that identity is a medical issue. Now, gender dysphoria, to Mr. Saylor's point, is a source of mental strain that can result from one's feelings. But those feelings in and of them, trying to manage those feelings in an unaccepting society. But those feelings in and of themselves, I don't think
No, gender
create.
dysphoria is-
Excuse me, I would like not to be interrupted. Thank you. Those feelings in and of themselves, I do not think consider or something that makes somebody disabled. And I don't think that we should be having this discussion within that framework. Now, it is also my understanding that the way policy works is that the federal law sets laws. The state then can create laws that do not conflict with federal law, but support that. Regulations then are implemented and guidelines are then implemented to support existing laws. And then policy is set at the board level to align with existing laws. Just because something is not written in federal law does not mean that it cannot be something that we have a policy on. So we just spent a lot of time talking about policy that maybe we want our librarians to look at 3 sources. I'm pretty sure that there's no federal law that requires that, but that doesn't mean it's not something that we can have in our policies.
Mr. Saylor and then Mrs. Rudolph.
Yeah, so gender dysphoria is a DSM-5. It's been that way since 2013 when they changed it from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria, and our school counselors are trained to treat those students. What's happening, unfortunately, in some of our schools is a student and or a parent will go directly to the principal and say, my student, and this happened in this school district, in one of our buildings this year. Parent goes to principal and says, my child is gender identity and my child is now a female. Didn't go to the counselor. When the counselor found out, met with the student and found out that the student was having other issues and was able to work with the parent. We're jumping before the horse. We're not going in a trained thought process of what we're No, I'm talking to the committee with the policy.
Mr. Saylor's
So we're-
responding directly to what I was saying about whether or not this is a disability.
No, I didn't say disability. It's a medical condition.
So he's pointing,
So-
that's semantics. So Mrs. Rudolph, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I would like to know if there's criteria or not. Is there criteria or isn't there? For what? Is there criteria for this?
What?
Oh, I'm not going to go there.
When you're talking about,
Are-
is there criteria for the application of the policy?
All
or?
of it. Is there going to be criteria or is this subjective?
Say it one more time.
Is there criteria or not criteria?
So with regards to acceptable behavior in schools,
No,
All of it.
transgenderism and gender
Yeah.
non-conforming students. What she's asking, what specifically does that mean?
Is there going to be criteria
Well,
or is there not criteria?
okay, so with regards to AR 103.2, transgender is a person whose gender identity and or gender expression is different from the gender that they were assigned at birth. That's the criteria. Gender identity is a person's deeply held internal sense of psychological knowledge of their own gender regardless of the gender they were assigned at birth. One's gender identity can be the same or different from the sex identified at birth. And gender nonconforming, there are 3 definitions as part of the AR. A term to describe people whose gender expression differs from stereotypical expectations about how they should look or act based on the gender they were assigned at birth. This includes people who identify outside traditional gender categories or assigned both genders or as gender neutral. Other terms that have similar meanings include gender diverse or gender fluid. So every policy is set up with a purpose, definitions, and then the action.
So that student would be labeled with one of those definitions.
A student, I don't think a student would be labeled, a student would identify. So an identity is a different thing than a
So
label.
they would have to meet that criteria, would define them.
Within their minds.
So
That's
would a
correct.
gen-
Just like you would and I do as well.
So would
Correct.
a gender-neutral student not be access to the girls' room or the boys' room? We would create a gender-neutral bathroom?
So I think that would come back to the.
Well, I'm asking Dr. Russell
Oh.
because she runs
I-
the school
no,
district.
I understand that she runs the school district,
What
but
exactly
we're having
does
a
that mean?
conversation.
But I want to talk about writing policy now. I don't want to have a conversation anymore. What exactly does this mean? That you have a? It's not funny. It's serious.
It's funny because I've opened this forum because I'm running the meeting now as a board committee. Laura White is running the meeting now. That we are having an open dialogue.
No, no,
You're done having a conversation, that's fine, then you can sit quietly because you've said what you've had to say. But we are having a dialogue about, is there criteria? What is the criteria? Ms. McGee has her hand up. So Dr. Russell can respond and speak, but we are going to have a dialogue about this as a community because that's what this subject deserves. Mrs. McGee.
So, is your intentions with creating this 720 or a 103 AR2 to remove policy 720? Is that going to be put in place of 720?
So the recommendation, Dr. Russell, on the agenda it reads as such. Sorry.
So as I mentioned, yes, there was discussion at the board level about the possibility of eliminating the policy. My recommendation was it comes back through policy committee for conversation before an action is taken, one way or the other. And so the policy has come back. I don't believe we need policy 720. However, in an effort to be transparent about how we are supporting students and what we are affording, I have suggested this AR.
So Mrs. Rudolph's question was legitimate. Do you have something else to ask?
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's such a stigma with mental health. And so I was just going to say gender dysphoria is a mental disorder, like Jason was saying. But just like ADHD is a mental disorder, just like depression, just like anxiety, like there's no, my children have IEPs and 504s and whatnot. And so like it's not like we look at it and we'll say like, oh, that's such a terrible thing. Like that doesn't. We don't need to say that that's a terrible thing. Like that, it is okay for people to have anxiety or depression or gender dysphoria or whatever. And so I was just going to say that because like we can say that there's mental health issue and that, you know, that is what it is, mental health. It is in the DSM-4, and that is how children are able to get help, you know, so that's a positive thing, that's how they're able to get help. So I was just going to like mention that it's okay to say that, because that is how they get help. And
Thank you for speaking up and saying that. And I think the response to that with regards to the stigma of the 504, I just wanted to be clear that I felt like words were getting twisted with what Mrs. Lofton's intention of that comment was. And I did not want there to be any insinuation that anyone that speaks up for help or is diagnosed to need assistance for being exceptional in any way is actually a stigma-driven item. So that was the inflection, and that is absolutely not the case. Dr. Russell.
Maybe I can let Ms. Dreibach speak, and then I wanted to just give a broader sort of analysis of where we are with restrooms to help the conversation along.
And I just wanted to quickly go off of what was being said, because so there's gender nonconformity, and that is not a mental disorder within the DSM-5. However, dysphoria, gender dysphoria is. And so there are transgender individuals that may have gender dysphoria, but that does not mean that every single individual who identifies as transgender has that disorder. So I just wanted to clarify that. So the DSM-5 does explicitly say that gender nonconformity is not itself a mental disorder. So,
thank you. Dr. Russell, go ahead. Well, 1 second, Mr. Jecker.
So what I was going to add is that there's clearly a difference in views here about access to restrooms. That's clear. And it's been ongoing, and we've had trouble inching ourselves forward to get somewhere where we can find common ground and be as comfortable as we like us to be as a district. And one of the things that came up early on was really around safety. And there were these worries about safety. And if individuals have the right to use the restroom that they identify with, are we putting others at risk? Again, administration has no knowledge of any risks or safety concerns associated with restroom use. However, I respect that people have brought that forward and they're wondering about it.
Mr. Keenan, if you could let Dr. Russell finish your thought, then you can have the floor. Dr. Russell,
I understand that you don't agree with that under any circumstance. I got it. So what I wanted to say was that in speaking with Mr. Weaver and our Director of Operations, we have consulted with an architect, and we are considering proposing to our board a feasibility study where we would look at restrooms and the number of single-use restrooms that we have and how they're set up and what the possibilities are to maybe even create more and what that cost would be, but what's possible in an effort to support the situation that right now is proving to be very challenging.
Mr. Keenan, did you have anything to add to the policy conversation with regards to the language?
The proposal is to revoke Policy 720. So what keeps men out of the girls' room then? Because you haven't been.
So you have data that indicates administration has not been keeping men out of the girls' restrooms. Is that what you're saying with that statement? I just want to be sure.
Yes.
Well,
We
he said it,
have
not you. So
examples.
is he saying it, or are you
Now,
saying it, Mr.
data
Saylor?
makes it sound like it's 100, but we have there are examples of people being allowed to use the opposite sex bathroom.
Yes, they do exist. That's correct.
Yes.
There are a few examples of that. Yes, that is accurate.
Did you I mean, you didn't. You didn't even think about the girls. Every single girl has a right not to see a penis when they go to the girls' room. Every single girl has that right. And you just didn't even, you don't even care. You didn't even care. And we had to put we had to. It's, I don't think that it needs, I mean, nobody wants it to be controversial, but girls need their space. And there are independent spaces for girls and for boys and for girls who are not traditional girls, whatever you want, however you want to define it. But if you have a room for girls and you go in and there are not girls in there, that is not right.
It's a challenge
You
for
can't
It's
put that sign on the girls' room if it's not a girls' room. You have to change that sign. You have to let the whole world know that it's not a girls' room. Because if you revoke 720, right? And what keeps men from going in there?
Men aren't, okay, a couple of things. First of all, please don't make a statement that I don't care. It's inaccurate. And with all due respect, it's inaccurate. Don't make a statement about what I care about or don't care about, please. Secondly, I don't know that any female students have seen any males naked. I don't have data on that or even an example or two of that. That's not happening. There's privacy in the girls' rooms. Now, we're getting into the weeds here. The issue is a real struggle with gender identity individuals using a restroom aligned to their identity and not their biological sex. That's the issue. How do we resolve that? Because not everybody agrees with your view. Not everybody agrees with my view. So where do we go? That's the purpose of the conversation. Maybe a feasibility study will help us to know how we can better situate ourselves and accommodate all students.
But that's not,
that's the goal.
in Roland's eyes and in my eyes, that's not what's happening.
Mrs. McGee,
the
go ahead.
discussion was going to be that we were going
You
to
have
talk
the
about
floor.
policy 7.
Go ahead. We're raising hands and having a
Thank
productive
you.
conversation.
I think what Mr. Kenyon doesn't understand or refuses to understand is when he's saying that there are men in the women's room, that is highly inaccurate. Unless you're talking about the boys who go in there to vape, those are the only boys in the girls' room. If you're talking about transgender women, they are girls. Girls in the girls' room, period. End of sentence.
Okay, does anyone else have anything to add? Someone that hasn't, Mr. Jagger, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pass you over earlier.
So I keep hearing there's been zero safety concerns in the girls' room, but it was my daughter. My daughter had the safety concern. This whole policy is because my daughter had a safety concern, and many other people had safety concerns for their daughters also. Now, if you open up a biology book, as Mr. Keenan would say, look male anatomy up. You're going to find a penis. Why are we dead set on putting penises into a girl's room? What is the obsession with that, and vice versa? Why? There's single-stall bathrooms. They don't want to use a male room. They don't want to use a girl's room. Single-stall bathroom.
Mrs. Dorr.
Yeah, Amber. Dorr. Sorry, everybody knows that by now. Sorry. So I guess my question is, with this policy 103, what is the consideration for biological females that don't feel comfortable in a bathroom when they see a biological male? And what's that accommodation look like? Because my understanding is policy 720 has made that accommodation without saddling the taxpayers with a refitting of bathrooms. So I guess that's where my concern is. And then in addition, we have children. We've talked about the books at length. Kids' brains are not fully developed until they're 25, and here we are putting them in situations that they are not emotionally and intellectually able to, are not mature enough to deal with. And we so wonder why anxiety is at an all-time high, not just in our district and in the world. Like, we are putting children in situations that they are not mature enough to deal with. And I just think policy 720 was put in place because those accommodations had been made. A majority of the students walked out in protest. That is why policy 720 is in place now. You're talking about a majority of the students.
Mrs. Dorr, that's a great point, and actually segues into the boots on the ground. So I don't know if anyone from the high school perspective or, obviously Dr. Russell can speak to the experience of the students as you have received information, either from them or observationally with regards to, complaints and safety, both before and after 720. And then also, if you could speak a little bit to the walkout and the parameters around that. I think that's important to touch on as well, because I think that there's a conversation that's ongoing about this majority business and numbers. 1 second, Donna, I promise. 1 second. And so I'd like to hear what administration has to say with the boots on the ground piece. And if Mrs. Rudolph would like to talk before that, that would be wonderful. Go ahead.
So I
let her talk.
Oh,
real
I'm
quick
sorry.
first.
I'm probably going to need to talk before and after.
Okay, go for it.
That walkout, it's really, really offensive to even suggest that those students did not know what they were walking out for. They had signs, they knew, people were handing out papers. Those students knew, they were very clear why they walked out, and to disregard them is really offensive and really disrespectful to those kids. It really invalidates them. And I know that there were a lot of attempts to stop the walkout from even happening, and I won't even get into that if I don't have to. I would prefer not to. But there was a lot of intimidation. When we talk about bullying and intimidation, there was an excessive amount of intimidation for those students who did walk out. It was tried, they were going to walk out the one day, and I said I won't get into it. I would prefer to not get into it. But I will not sit here and listen to any conversations about those students did not know what they were walking out about or they wanted to get out of class. And though we are completely disregarding all of those students, and that is how they felt like they expressed themselves. And so now I feel like the conversation is going to discredit that and say, well, they didn't really know, and this and that, and we're going to try and ask them again. We're going to have a do-over and try to find out another way. They used their voices. They stood up. My daughter came to the school board meeting and spoke.
Yeah.
Like, she went on national television. You don't just do that if you just really just want to get out of class.
No, I understand that point of view.
I don't want to have a conversation about invalidating those students. And just as the definitions of my other point was the definitions that you read, thank you for reading them. I heard there were 3 different categories. Is that correct?
With regards to what was developed.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. So my other point, besides the students, the walkout, was when you have these 3 categories of, you read the definitions very clearly. I could tell there was a lot of thought put into each one of those definitions.
Well, I didn't write them, but thank you for whoever did.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that you picked those. You selected those. So what is to say that anybody could just, when I asked about criteria or no criteria, anybody could identify as such?
Yeah, I guess.
And that is
devil's
the concern.
advocate back to you would be, why would you do that if it was not genuine?
Oh, okay.
I mean that genuinely.
Okay.
Honestly.
But so that is not acknowledging that it's so. It is not morally correct. It's not. It's bad. People shouldn't.
But how do you go through? How do you approach any issue if you don't do so with the best intention? Like,
Okay.
I can't just assume, for example, if I walk into a store and it's late at night and it's me and one other person, I don't walk in, and if they maybe look suspicious or not really quite like somebody that that maybe there's something about them puts me off, I can't assume that they're going to hurt me, because I just feel like, I don't know, and maybe you would feel the opposite. Maybe you would walk in and be like, oh no, I'm out of here. I can't be here in the building with that person. So I think it comes down to presumption of.
I never said that about assuming harm.
No, well, no.
So I want to remove that from that conversation. I want to acknowledge that because that's not
No,
what
I
I'm
know
saying.
that's not what you're saying. I'm just using that as an example. But I'm using that as an example about harm in the idea that you said, well, what would prevent somebody from saying I'm this or I'm that? And
Anybody could. Anybody could. That's why I asked in the beginning, is there criteria or not criteria? You mentioned the criteria of what it would take in order to be able to, have the accommodation. Okay,
Right.
but anybody could.
Theoretically.
There's no criteria stopping anybody from identifying. We're not having a 504 for them. We're not labeling them. That's why I asked about that. Anybody can, and that's the concern.
So my
not the
question
people,
would-
not
yeah.
necessarily the people who legitimately, to your point, morally do fit into those. We're not.
Understood you're not pointing fingers at them. I
Right.
understand that part.
It opens up to anybody who is nefarious.
So I guess my
could.
question would be, is that happening? That would be
It
my
could.
question, and that's why I asked for the boots on the ground. And with regards to student voice,
Okay.
I think that there is no invalidation. I mean, I am proud of every single student that comes to any board meeting and speaks up. It is
They don't
remarkable.
really want to.
No, well, you know what though? Some of them do, and it takes a
No,
lot of
they don't.
courage. It takes a lot of courage to be able to get up and do that, and it is very, very hard. And part of my desire to create this conversation and an opportunity to have this discussion is because it is hard, and we shouldn't have to feel unsafe in any environment. Let me tell you how bad it hurts when you're sitting and you see people making fun of you, or you're sitting and you see people heckling and whispering. It hurts.
Oh,
and
yeah,
I know
that
you
happened
know.
to my daughter. Right
Listen,
behind her.
Listen,
Yeah.
I know. Listen, and I know every single one of us from every experience that any of us have had in our lives. We're adults. It hurts no less when you're an adult than it does when you're a child. And so what I am about is listening, responding, and then doing what's best for everybody within reason. That's truly from my heart. That's truly, truly where I'm coming from. And whether or not you agree with me or not, that's okay. We can disagree. We can all disagree and have individual 50 different opinions. But so what you're saying about honoring the children's voice, student voice, 100%. However, I would argue that not every single student understood. Your child 100%, no question, you're telling me that she did? That's wonderful.
I can also tell you that perhaps there were some, I will agree that there were some kids, maybe there could be. Okay. However, I'd like to also tell you about the population of students that did fall into the intimidation by their teachers, by their coaches, by their parents, by their friend group that didn't go.
And so that should all
The
be
email that went
acknowledged.
home.
It should be acknowledged, reported, and recognized. It's universal. There are no exceptions here.
Dr. Russell wants to know what that email I'm talking about.
And so those are the examples of documentation. And I hate to say, all of us, I get stories home every day. Unless it's documented, I don't want to say it didn't happen, but how are you documenting it? The folks that sent emails, it's documented. But again, I want to hear about the boots on
you
the-
don't know what I'm talking about.
I don't.
I
And
know.
It doesn't matter
Can I
to me.
respond to Dr.
Yeah.
Russell? She wants to. Am I correct?
Do you need
Would
to take it offline to?
Are you asking what email I'm talking about?
Yeah, and I don't know if it is better to take it offline and talk
No,
after. Okay.
just about the walkout. When you sent the email home to parents, telling parents about the walkout.
Okay.
So
That
that's the boots
I
on the
know your
ground.
intention was not to intimidate students not to attend. However, it was unavoidable.
It was interpreted that way, is what you're saying.
It was unavoidable. With informing the parents, it just happened to be an unavoidable consequence of getting information out there, because there were students who would like to have walked out. However, because it provoked a parent-child conversation, parents realized that it was not favored upon, for them to do so, and the fact that the campus was shut down to the public, and notification went out about that. There were a lot of
barriers,
signals and barriers for parents and students, the public in general, the police presence at every single entrance during all drop-off that morning. You know, it was very clear that it was not a welcomed participation. Teachers, coaches, it was difficult for students when you mentioned about getting up and speaking.
Right.
It was very difficult for a student to do that. They didn't get rewarded.
Thank you for the voice on that. Can we speak to just boots on the ground, and then we'll go back to opening it up? Dr. Russell, are you okay with that?
Yeah, so I think the question was really around some of the details of the walkout, and I'd have to go back and read my email. I do appreciate what you're calling out. Of course, that's not the intent. The intent is always to keep our students safe if we support something like this. There were 300 students or so that walked out that day. I can look to Mr. Marsh, but that was the number that was reported to me. It was 300 students or so. Okay, and so that may be, and I don't know if you mean came out after the school day or came out after the initial third period walkout.
I think that this is semantics about the number, so if it's okay, let's not discuss the semantics of the number. There were a lot, and like I said, there were many more who did not go because of the intimidation.
Yeah, and you know, I think there certainly was a large group of students that chose to have a voice in that manner on that day and that morning. I would agree with that. And maybe the numbers don't matter. There were a lot of students that chose to have a voice that day, or for whatever reason chose to participate in that walkout. I don't want to argue what every student was thinking, and I don't have the information to do that. But yeah, it was a large walkout. I think there's somebody back there.
So I just want to give administration at the high school a chance to respond with regard to incidents of discomfort or safety before and after 7:20. I think that's really the crux of the whole introduction of the AR 103-2, and then also your recommendation to eliminate 7:20 as it's written.
So I'm Ryan Marsh, house principal at the high school. Been in the district a long time. I share that. I've run 5 of the 7 buildings, worked at all of the levels. And I'll share this in factual terms from my perception, the facts, and then I'll give you my perception from my role. I, out of my office, have not had one concern out of this. I'm not sure of the reference made earlier. I did not have any follow-up directly with the concern that was raised earlier. I myself have not had any issues. And I'll say this, and not trying to be inflammatory, I gave you my background just to share this thought with you. I am actively working with 25 student needs right now that are pretty heavy, and many more that are waiting for my attention. This is not one of them, okay? So I will tell you, as a principal at the high school, I could not be more proud, and I can't even, we're getting good at walkouts. I cannot tell you, please let me though, because I cannot tell you how important it is to tell you all how well all of our students behave under those circumstances. If the worst behavior we have to deal with in a walkout is kids on top of each other's shoulders for safety, we're doing okay. I will tell you that I stand at a corner right here, I direct them, we are, as I describe it to students, we are pleasant, always respectful, and they return that. So regardless of the issue. So I will say this, and then I'll give you some numbers. Did some preparation for tonight for that, but I'll say this, and this is my perception. I'm not saying that this is fact, okay? My perception is that we are having a conversation as adults that the students are not having, okay? Now maybe in pockets it's talked about, or it's brought home from this meeting and it's talked about. I was so very thankful to get through 720 and get to January and say that we're going to get back to some normalcy. And no matter what this committee decides to do with this policy, I ask that you do not disrupt our schools any more than it is happening. Because our kids, and if our kids want to do a walkout, there's procedures for that. We'll talk to them, and we will not intimidate them. We will work with them, okay, as I've described to you. All right? Dialogue with our kids is what makes this happen. Talking about impacts and how we can move forward with each other is what works with our kids. Now that happens individually in my office 4 days a week. So I just offer that to you, and I don't mean to be so emphatic about it, but when you talk about carrying an investment in the district, I think I've demonstrated it over the years. I care about these kids tremendously. They know that. The job's incredibly difficult, and we take care of it. I worry that we're going to do something here that's going to re-disrupt and the whole student body again. And whether it's a walkout or not, whatever it is, I think this committee has a responsibility to set an example to our kids about how we have that dialogue. And I'm backdropping that to say, and you can all boo me out of the room, I'm backdropping that to say that out of my office, I have not had one issue about this. I got a lot of other serious issues that I'm dealing with that need my time, attention, and detail, scrutiny, and otherwise. This ain't one of them. I'm just being honest with everybody, and I hope that helps. For some details, in terms of the paragraphs that are written as they're written, as we understand them as administrators at high school, we would be able to have procedures in place to support that would focus around individualizing for students. We do have a number of single stalls in the locker rooms particularly, which is a paragraph I prepared on specifically talking with our phys ed teachers. Right now, okay, so there's multiple phys ed classes that are in at one time. So think of multiple sections in one class period. So it's important, the semantics there. So what the phys ed teachers are sharing with us is that a maximum of any given period across all the classes there of any kids who are changing at all for gym. Kids who change at all for gym is 5. Most periods, it's 1 or 2 kids that actually change for phys ed. Okay? So that gives you a perspective, at least in the locker room, of what that action might look like at class time. All right? Now, we do have a number of single stalls in the bathrooms. I think it ranges, my notes say from 8, I think, in the female, and I think it's 7 single stalls there. We also have individual, bathrooms outside of the weight room, right outside of those locker rooms that can be utilized. And then we also have additional team rooms there that have individual stalls. So in terms of meeting the need based on the numbers that we're seeing and any potential that would come from that, there's no concern of meeting those abilities to individualize. My feedback would be, and I wouldn't anticipate this, but my feedback would be that it would be a numbers game to a point. You know, I mean, if we have, and I believe that the number that was researched last was less than 5 students who actually have at any time used another bathroom, and I'm not quoting that number. I think that's what was shared. That have used any bathroom, then to me this is manageable. If it were 75, 100, 150, then we have a different conversation around a facility. So I'm not trying to be lecturing. I really sit quietly and try to listen. I'm trying to maintain a high level of professionalism here. I've known many of you. I reacquainted with Mrs. Dorr here after years. We have a special community, and we've had a special school for a long time, and it's been based around individualized and dialogue, and dialogue that is solutions based. So I just offer that. And I'm not trying to be inflammatory. I'm just an administrator at the high school at the end of the day.
Thank you, Mr. Marsh. Is anyone, I'm so sorry.
I'm going to ask a question around that. I mean, so are you talking those numbers? There hasn't been any issues since policy 720 has been in place, because if there's, roughly you said around 5 or whatever that number of students that fall within that category, then I would just think that the accommodations are there. If we flip, you said it's a numbers game, if the policy should flip to 103, could we potentially be in a position where you've got that higher number, 75, 100, hundreds of girls that wouldn't be comfortable in a bathroom?
So here, let me...
Sorry.
When I look at the language in this policy and the question that is on the table about females and their comfortability, as you and I were sidebarring a little bit, and sorry about that, Doctor, isn't completely covered here, right? But I think that the language around that, because practically, I'm going to say again, what I anticipate, I have no data, I have no research to support this, because we haven't had this, right? So I'm not going to go 7, I don't know. But if we were to see an increase in that concern, that would be directly related to me and how we meet that accommodation. And we did that number study that tells us how many individual stalls and all of that. That would be the debate here, as I'm getting the vibe. And I do need to be quiet because I'm going to get a visit from Dr. Russell tomorrow.
She's so intimidating.
I'm just kidding. I'm just trying to provide some levity. I would say this. That if that number were to grow, that would go to the facility piece. And the sticking point that I think I'm hearing in the room now, that again, set an example for our kids, but the sticking point in the room is that does not make a reasonable accommodation for my female daughter, because I don't want her to see male genitalia or even run that risk of seeing male genitalia. And if I have to say, well, I got to go somewhere else to avoid that possibility, I'm telling you, there's no case record that has any of that, right? So I can't say. I think I'll say this too. Our community is phenomenal. We've got great kids. Our kids do what we ask them to do 99.9% of the time. If we take the time to explain to them the rationale and the reasoning for something, and here's how you make a choice. This happened after the high-profile incidents in our building around violence, okay? And we have meetings with those kids, and we talk with those kids. That resonated with them, right? So we talk with them. That's where we get the value, right? And it's no defense to you all. They're growing up in high school. My days in elementary school, I liked them, but you can't have a deep conversation, and it involves mom and dad. High school, we are trying to empower these kids through. You're trying to help them make choices as they go through. So I think this is all within the realms of being able to do that. The numbers piece, I can't predict for you, you know?
I see a bunch of different hands. I see, okay. Ms. Rosas, go ahead.
Hi, Alicia Rosas from Skip Pack. Just a small comment on, in response to what Mr. Marsh was just saying too, and the question that Mrs. Dorr had. We did have, I think it was 4 years of the policy already in place where there was no issues at all. So in terms of the numbers and whether or not that's going to be, going backwards from the female perspective, we had been living in a world where we had no issue at all on that. So just wanted to make that comment.
Were there any other comments, or Mrs. Rudolph, I know you want to speak. Is there any other questions from Mr. Marsh that have it said? Oh, go ahead. And then I'll
Thank
come
you.
back to you.
I actually
Donna.
have two things. A question about the new policy that you guys have proposed. Is that just for students, or does that apply to adults coming into the building as well when we've got events on the weekends, sporting, things like that?
Right.
Does that apply
So
to
let's
adults?
let's pause for a second and talk about the differences between policy and administrative regulations, if we could, Dr. Russell.
Yeah, so this is actually an administrative reg, so it's not a policy. Technically, the administrative regulation is intended to assist administrators and staff in how they need to uphold policy. And the policy it's referencing is 103, that discrimination Title IX policy that we talked about a few minutes ago, where we are avoiding any discrimination against any student in the building. I think your question about adults versus students is a good one, and I think that's another conversation that we need to have. Right now, we're focused on students, on kids.
But I think that needs to be part of the policy. I mean, if
Not
you're
a
going to make it a
policy.
policy in the school,
Yeah.
that you have to cover all of those situations, because, you've got strangers coming in the buildings here for events and things, and they get wind of what's going on here. That right there ends up being a security issue, a safety issue for girls and women in the bathrooms here after hours and things. And you're opening up a door. Once you kick a door open like this, it's open. And I wanted to jump on what Mr. Marsh was saying. Right now, 720 is in place, and it seems to be working okay. And it's about accommodations. You're ruling for the majority of students with policy 720. You're ruling for them. There are accommodations, just like, for example, if you had a handicapped student, you make a ramp here and there. You're not tearing down all the stairways in the school district. You're making a ramp for them or having them using elevators. It's the exact same thing. It's an accommodation for those students that fall into that. And it's a minority. So you cannot rule for the minority that the majority has to be put into a different situation. And it seems like 720 is working.
I wanted to answer your question because it wasn't answered. If we follow the administration, they're asking us to remove policy 720, which removes the part of the policy that has visitors' restroom access. So the answer to your question, since it wasn't answered, is yes. That would mean anyone can use any bathroom since that policy be revoked.
Thank you, Mr. Saylor.
So again, to the point of the language,
Can I just make one more quick point?
Sure, Mr. Saylor.
Dr. Russell, since the conversation happened, have you learned of issues in the past that never made it to the superintendent about students feeling uncomfortable because they saw someone of the opposite sex in their locker room or bathroom?
I have heard that primarily through you in conversations.
You
with
haven't heard it
you.
from any student specifically?
What I have learned from a student in particular is that once the conversation started, individuals did share, that doesn't feel quite comfortable for me. I don't know if I'm at a readiness for that.
Nobody told you about something that happened in the past when they were in middle school?
I feel like that means that you should remember
I
a
do.
conversation.
I also feel like that. So maybe we can talk more about that. If we had a conversation and that is something that I shared, let's talk about that.
We just had it after the board meeting.
In December.
No, a couple weeks ago.
Oh, in January.
Yeah.
All right, let me think about it.
Mrs. Lofton.
So one thing that I remember going back a few years when we were having detailed discussions about the handbooks and some of the discipline code in the handbooks, and one of the possible categories of things that you can do wrong that's in the whole table of everything that you can do wrong and what the consequences are is inappropriate behavior. And that is my understanding of it, and the way it was explained to me is that is a intentionally broad and vague category so that administration has the opportunity. If somebody is walking into the girls' room saying, ha ha, I'm a girl today, but they don't typically express themselves and conduct themselves and bring to the district the identity that they are female, that could be considered an inappropriate. But again, I think it goes back to what is that person's behavior upon going into the restroom? Are they behaving in a way in which I'm here to use the bathroom because I have a biological need and that needs to be fulfilled by the use of the plumbing, right? That is not the same as somebody who is entering a restroom for the purpose of harassing somebody else. And I think that that is a very important distinction that we're,
That's why I asked if there's criteria or not.
right. So,
And there isn't. The short answer is
well,
there-
no,
there
the
is not.
criteria are,
There's no criteria.
so the
It's just-
definition, there's a definition provided that it
But-
is a person whose gender identity
I know.
and or gender
Ms. Wolf read
expression.
all of them, and she
Right.
did a phenomenal job of reading them, and I'm very clear about that. However, anybody can identify as any one of those three individuals. There's no criteria to say whether a person identifies as one of those three criteria, definitions.
Right,
Any one
well-
of those three types of individuals, anybody can identify as any one of those individuals. And that's where the problem is, because it opens it up to people who do behave poorly, people with no moral compass, people
So,
just
again, I
doing
think if
whatever, and
somebody
that's why
is
there's a concern. There's
be-
no criteria.
I think if somebody's behaving poorly, it goes back to what Mr. Marsh said about having those conversations. You know, the students who are in the buildings are in the buildings with their community 180 days out of the year. And their
People
community,
can be fluid, gender fluid, and you can change because there is no criteria. And that's why it's difficult, because anybody can identify at any time as anything they want. And that's why it's hard. We're not saying anything about that community of people. We're just saying because we can't even properly classify it or define it or define what it takes to have one of those definitions.
so
Anybody can do it, and
Let's-
that's why it's difficult.
go back to our policy 103 title, which is that we don't discriminate against people, right? So if somebody,
Well, we're discriminating against people who are females and want safety, like all of those people, kids in the walkout.
May I ask
Okay,
a very
hold-
specific question to Mr. Marsh? May I just ask one real quick question? I noticed when I was
Can you
walking.
put your microphone, just make sure, yeah.
when I was walking in today, there was a group of individuals on the auxiliary gym. They were playing dodgeball, shirts and skin style, right? Does that normally? I don't know if that happens during the normal gym day, but it happened. As I was walking from the basketball game to here, I saw kids playing dodgeball, and they had shirts off, and some didn't. So I assumed they were shirts versus.
No, I don't know what that was. I noticed that too, and I was wondering why shirts were off too. But I don't even know what that activity was. It could have been community ed. It could have been.
But that's getting to my question. So if a female student who identifies as a male, are they going to be able to take their shirt off? Since we're not going to discriminate on their gender identity.
Say again.
If a female student who identifies as a male, will they be able to fully take their shirt off
if
they want to?
In a gym class. In a gym, no, we don't allow. That's not. I would imagine what you saw today was a community ed activity, and the only reason I say that, and I won't get too personal here, is I was walking across that gym for a different purpose to get to a different place, and
community ed events still have to follow.
Well, yeah, but I don't know. Like we're talking, I don't know what that was. Like I don't know what that was, but I can tell you that I saw someone who was not a teacher working with kids talking about dodgeball strategy.
Yeah.
So I have to believe that was community ed, but I did take note of, and I did not stop, I did take note of the no shirts on the way back, because I went up to watch the swim meet for a little while and read email. So that's...
Let's use the swim meet for an example. They take the men don't have their shirts on.
Right. But we're, like, there's nothing that I'm seeing. This is about, like,
we're getting down a rabbit hole of seven.
Right,
So just hold that thought. Mr. Marsh, I want to just clarify with what you said. It was very concise, and I appreciate the way that you verbalized it, truly. My question to you initially was, can you say that everything, your commentary, was it everything since 720? Or is that your experience in general, even before 720? Because 720 has a shelf life here.
I've never had, I say it again, I've never out of my office in any of my stops dealt with anything around this. Before
or after?
In 22 years.
And so, your colleagues, your other houses.
No, I'm saying in terms of
I'm
the
sorry,
actual
what was that?
concern of somebody in a bathroom and what was discussed. That's what I'm saying.
But as far as the colleagues go, and I'm not trying to get you to speak for Dr. Moss or Mr. Burke. Yeah. Next time you can put words in her mouth. So to that point, I guess when I was inferring what you were saying, I took that from a historical perspective, but I just want to clarify for the committee, and I want to hear from anybody on the committee that we haven't heard from yet. I would like to have them weigh in because ultimately we need to reach a recommendation to the board. That's what this whole is about. So if you could just clarify if I'm interpreting what you've said correctly, and then I think, who else is on the committee? Dr. Weston, I don't think we've heard from you. And then any other, I don't know if Mr. Moran wants to dip his toe into this excitement, but Mr. Marsh, go ahead.
Neither before nor after 720 was passed have I, as an administrator in this district, dealt with a concern about a student of another sex in the bathroom of a student. I've never had that concern. Myself, I've never dealt with it.
So devil's advocate wise, I guess my question is, as a committee member representing the high school, if we move forward from the policy committee with the recommendation as presented, can you speak to that?
If you move forward with the language as it is presented?
With the new AR, the way that it was on the agenda tonight.
Well, what I have here in terms of the 3 paragraphs in the middle that are in the policy.
In the AR.
I mean, in the AR, sorry. Is that a lot of what we do for safety for things around other things would be in place here. So we would work individually with the student. What we generally do is this would have frequent check-ins for safety and suitability. So what that means is that is either an every day or an every other day check-in. We would, pardon me, based on the individual request, whether it be a single-use facility or a place to change separately, would determine who would do that check-in each day. In other words, if it's in a phys ed setting, we would have the phys ed teacher have that check-in with them, okay? So that would be what we would do, and we would work with that individually with those students. And then just like other things, that is a team that involves the teacher, in this case, if it's a phys ed teacher, and the counselor's administrator, and then we would work to support with that student, that individual, any impacts that may be happening as a result of that. So that is not unlike, like you could take that rough template, and that's not unlike a student who feels unsafe because of a conflict that they're having in school with a student, or a student who feels unsafe for any number of reasons. We would increase contact, we would individualize that approach, and we could follow that policy in that first paragraph. Sorry, scrolling up, making sure.
Can I respond while he's?
And then,
Give me 1 second, Mrs. Rudolph. So I guess, Mr. Marsh, is there any language that you saw in the presented AR that you would revise or add or change that would
well,
maybe?
I had a clarifying question, and I just think it's, and again, I don't have an opinion on this particularly. I just, in terms of when we define in the policy, or pardon me, in the AR, when we define in the AR gender identity, transgender and gender nonconformity, and then in the AR later on in the second paragraph it says any gender segregated facility. So I think if you look up gender, I don't know that those are the semantics that you're looking to have there. I was a little confused by that and talk to that, because if as I read that second paragraph, in any gender segregated facility, any student who is uncomfortable using a shared facility, regardless of the region, shall upon their request be provided with a safe, reasonable alternative, may include the provision to use nearby private restroom, office, or separate changing schedule. Okay, but if we call it gender segregated, we're not saying that in this, are we? We're saying that biologically.
It should say
how
gender
so
specific.
that's a little
maybe?
confusing to me to read.
Yeah.
And maybe the confusion is all mine, but
No, the word
but-
segregated, I think, calls a question.
Yeah, so-
I think maybe, I don't know, maybe gender specific.
but if
Sumter.
Can I respond?
Yes, go ahead, Ms.
Okay, so what we learned from what you shared, Mr. Marsh, thank you for that. It was very helpful. I learned that the students are not going to you before or after 7:20. So we can't really utilize that as a measure of how the students are feeling, because hundreds, as we've acknowledged, hundreds of students participated in the walkout. So if they were not going to you before there was a concern, it just wasn't able to be measured as evidenced by they came to you about it.
So let me be clear. I have not had in my office had any cases where a student sex was different, went into another bathroom, and that raised an issue.
Well, what about the Jaggers? You're disregarding them.
As I said in my statement, I did not have a hand in that. I'm saying out of
Okay,
my
so
office.
how many other things are you going to disqualify?
I'm not
No,
disqualifying
he's not
anything. I'm just telling.
disqualifying.
Okay.
I'm not even giving
He
you
can
a
only-
thought
he
on
can
my
only
opinion.
speak-
Okay, so what we've learned is that the students aren't going to you per se, because
Well,
if
that
they
would be a
were, you would have had
conclusion.
all those hundreds of students in there. So we can't really use that as a measure of whether or not there's a concern.
Point taken, Donna.
Thank you.
Got it. Mr. Jagger.
My other question too is, at the board meetings, the one lady had come in and spoke about her child and losing about 20 minutes, I believe it was, having to go use the single stall bathroom, and that was for the less than 1% of students. Flip that around, 99% of students. Are they going to miss the entire day waiting for the bathroom?
So I guess that's sort of devil's advocate, right? So I guess you would then, your assumption then is that everyone will have an issue using,
I'm sure everyone won't, but if the less than 1% is losing 20 minutes according to
could less than
that
1%
lady,
have an issue, hypothetically? I'm just
is
putting it
300
out
plus
there.
students
I'm being
less than-
genuine
less than
about that.
1%? Is 300 plus students less than 1%?
Like, do we need another walkout? Is that what, do we need to have that happen? That's how they use their voice. Do you need to have them do we need a do-over? Like, what is it going to take?
So just when you ask about a do-over, the reason that we're talking about this now is because, hold on, just give me 1 second.
Invalidating them.
No,
Yes,
no.
completely invalidating them. And the
You're
ones who
invalidating
didn't
it until we make another headline. Once we're in the headlines again, then we'll do something, right?
Go viral again, and then Riley Gaines picks up the story.
It seems so.
in
To me, it's so
Australia.
adversarial, and I don't understand why it has to be that way. If we're trying to come to an agreement for what's best, literally for everybody.
Because you brought this back up after it was already settled in
This was not settled. It was not settled.
Talk about the
It
five
was
board
forced through.
members-
It never came to the
five
policy
board
committee.
members, a majority when you brought it up. To
Donna,
vote,
what is the majority now?
5 board members in December when you brought it up to vote to remove it that night.
The vote for that
5 of
night was
them.
to come back to policy, which is why we're all
No,
here.
you wanted to remove it that night.
And the
it
vote was
brought back
to come
tonight
back to policy.
Because the majority, five board members voted to bring it back tonight, as their choice was, take it off that night or move it to tonight.
And that, right.
Okay, but 5 board members, 2 of them were newly elected, all 5 of them, the majority voted, and that should tell you that the 5 of them voted that
What
night
that
to
told
not
me,
remove it.
what that told me, respectfully, what that told me was that they chose to go through the process that, hold on,
They
that
had
did
2
not,
choices.
they had 2 choices, and they chose to bring it back to policy.
Can you just state that for everybody who doesn't know?
Oh yes, I'm so sorry. In December, it was brought to the agenda at my request to have 720 removed. And the reason that I asked for it to be removed was because when it was introduced to the board, in general, it had never come through policy committee. So, because I wanted it to come through policy committee and go through the normal process and procedure that all other policies that govern the school district go through, I asked for it to be suspended and for it to come back. The portion that you're referencing with regards to the 5-4 vote was that it not be suspended while it came back to policy, that it stay in place.
Why did you want it suspended that night? But the
Because I
point is,
felt
five
this
board members,
was
the
this
majority,
was the
didn't
reason.
want it done that way.
Understood. The reason that I wanted it suspended is because it never went through the proper channel to begin with.
So we could talk about it tonight.
So we could talk about it tonight, which we are.
We are not. We are talking about AR that the administration, we have not opened up policy 720 at all to talk about. Nothing. That's not true. I was under the thought process that we were going to talk about policy 720. I did
Well,
not
but
find
you didn't
out.
think that because you saw the agenda.
But that's what they
I did not.
voted for.
I did not find out until I saw the agenda that the administration has suggested removing policy 720, and the conversation tonight has not been about 720 at all. It's been about an AR, which which removes all protections to the locker rooms, which removes all protections to visitors in the school building, and only facilitates a conversation on what a bathroom would be and who gets access to the bathroom, literally cutting 2/3 of policy 720 that we have not talked about.
So you weren't bringing it back to discuss and fix 720. You're talking about just sabotaging it, removing it, going back to 103 and fixing 103 to be the way that it was intended to be
And the
in
reason,
the first place.
but again,
but
the
that's a bait and switch. That's not what the people.
It's not a bait and switch.
Yes,
It's not a
that-
bait and switch. And the reason,
Taylor just pointed that
well,
out.
in his perception, it's a bait and switch. But let me tell you something. When the policy 720 was presented initially, okay,
Then let's talk about fixing 720.
If you ask the people in this
720
room
was
to
never
vote,
was never presented to the policy committee to begin with.
Then let's
if
do
you
that.
ask the community
Then that's a
members,
separate conversation.
That's what this is supposed
No,
to
no,
be.
no, no, no.
yeah, it is.
That is
She's
not.
right.
What
If
it's
you ask the
supposed to be.
community
That's
members
what- I don't-
tonight
That's
to
what the
vote,
people
because you want to
voted
have the
on.
community's input, if we voted right now, the majority of the community would vote in favor to keep policy 720.
Voted right now. We have how could you
But
have
why
a
don't
vote
you
right
take a
now?
vote?
That's
Go
just.
If you ask the people to raise
ahead.
their hand, the majority of the
Okay.
community members would
So-
vote to keep policy 720.
Of-
So is it the
Fix it.
will of the board, is it the will of the policy committee to listen to the community members here today?
So I-
Because if that's the case, I would like to ask every community member to raise their hand if they want to keep policy 720,
Okay, so
and then
there's
that's
a-
what the board should do.
Okay, thank you for pointing out the policy committee community that came out, as if that was a true cross-section of the community.
That's what you
the
asked
true
for.
cross-section
You
of the
said at the
community
beginning of the meeting
has
we were
put
gonna
me
listen
in
to the
charge
community.
of facilitating a dialogue that we have not had in 2 years.
You said you were going to listen to the community. The community.
I would like-
I think we
And-
listened to the
wants keep
community
policy
during the
720.
election. Okay,
Okay,
can
no,
we
no,
stop?
no.
Can we
We're not
please
going
stop
off
and
the
have
rails.
a-
We're
a
not going off the
productive
rails. We're not
conversation?
going off the rails here. We have had, I said, I clocked 9 o'clock, and we have 10 minutes to wrap this up. So, listen. The job of the policy committee is to listen to the community's input. Thank you for all showing up. Thank you for engaging. Thank you for being transparent in your feelings and your opinions. The policy committee then takes a recommendation, they take it and coordinate with administration, and then they bring it to the school board. The board of 9, not 4 people that are here representing the school board. Hold the thought.
5 people voted to bring this to
Hold the
policy committee to discuss policy
Noted.
720.
Noted. It's documented. Noted.
So we gonna.
Ms. White, I have a question.
Dr. Weston is on the policy committee. We have not heard your voice even one time tonight, other than for 109. So if you could weigh in on this, and then we're going to wrap up with a recommendation
There's obviously a lot of passion in the community around this policy and around this issue. I have made no secret of my feelings about Policy 720 over the last several months since it was introduced. I feel it is a solution that was lacking a problem to start with. As Mr. Marsh has said, you know, he's not been made aware of any issues since Policy 720 was introduced. He was not aware of any issues before Policy 720 was introduced. As far as, you know, the overall idea, the contention that this leads to co-ed bathrooms, unisex bathrooms, to me is a ludicrous one. It is not what we had before. It is not what we will have afterwards. I actually lived in a living situation for a number of years, 4 years in a dormitory where we had actual unisex bathrooms. If you want to put a hard stop around adults starting at age 17, we actually had students younger than 17 in that dormitory. Nobody saw my genitalia. I didn't see anybody else's genitalia either. There's no reason there's no, not by definition is anybody going to be seeing anybody else's junk. I appreciate what Mr. Marsh is saying also about disruption to the student community. I don't want to see more walkouts taking place either. 720, in my opinion, was unnecessary, unenforceable, and very likely illegal based on what we've seen with bathroom policies in other school districts around us. To me, the fix to 720 is getting rid of it and introducing something like this. What I would like to see, as I said in email communications to other people on the committee, I see this as a starting point for development of an actual transgender student policy. And I did some counting. There are a number of districts around us that actually have transgender student policies. 8 districts in Montgomery County. Of the 22 districts in Montgomery County, 8 of them have transgender student policies. 12 of the 22 districts actually have gender and gender ID protections written into their policy 103. So we are certainly not unique in that respect. Bucks County, 3 of the 13 districts have transgender policies. Chester, 1 of 14. Delaware County, 7 of 15 districts have transgender student policies. Philadelphia School District also has transgender student policies. That cover a number of issues. I'd like to see this as a starting point for actually developing a comprehensive policy dealing with transgender student issues. I want to see a group dedicated to development of that policy. I want to see student input on that policy. I want to see faculty input. I want to see community input. We need to come up with something that works for all of our students and makes all of our students feel comfortable, accepted, and part of the community. This is a starting point for that.
Very good. Have you read Norristown's policy on transgender students in the school district?
I do not know the details off the top of my head, but yes, I have read it and I have it downloaded on my computer. Is there something you'd like me to look at that?
Yeah, they have policies on sports as well as overnight trips. I was curious if you thought that was a good idea to have at Perkiomen Valley.
I would have to see what the actual wording is, and as a Perkiomen Valley community, as we develop a policy, we would be able to see what we think is appropriate for us.
So most of the policies developed in Montgomery County School District stem from Norristown's policy. They were one of the first school districts to have a full-blown policy on transgender students in the school district.
How's that policy working out for Norristown?
I don't go to Norristown School District. From the board
But
members that I
you're,
talk
but you're
to there,
knowledgeable about the policy, and I would assume you would be also, if you're talking about it, you would know something about the impact of the policy on the community.
well, they've had some issues. They recently had a student at an overnight trip where they forgot to alert the other parents that it was a different gender. So as all policies, there are problems that happen. I do know people that work at Norristown School District. I know some of their board members. So I wouldn't necessarily say that all policies are great, but do you think that that type of policy should be something we should use as our roadmap to success?
I think that we should look at all of the policies around here and see what we think would work best for us.
Elaborate with what happened on that
Can we hold off on that thought, because that is important, and I think that takes us into a future policy creation with regards to.
It seems like there is a lot to continue to discuss.
100%.
It was a great conversation
Yeah.
and discussion.
I 100% agree with you.
And this format, I think, worked very well, so compliments to you, Ms.
No
Wright.
compliments needed. I just think
But
that people should have the
I
option.
think that there is further conversation to be had before jumping into anything. Just as we didn't want to jump into it the first time, let's not.
That's why
review
we're gonna do it.
history,
That's
and let's
do-over.
give thorough,
Yep.
time for this, just like we're doing with the books.
100% Mulligan situation, no question. And so that'll be the last word as far as comments. Please come back. Please come back. I just want 1 second. I do want. Did you have something, Ms. Dr. Champagne? This is. If you could just introduce yourself briefly. I don't know that the majority of folks here know who you are.
I was going to introduce myself first, so thank you for calling that out.
Thank you.
As one of the newest members of the team, it has been very insightful tonight just to hear the varying perspectives within the room. I do believe, though, from what I understand, the policy, the proposed administrative regulation is really designed to create a safe and inclusive environment for all students, which is free from discrimination, and that includes considering the needs of our students who have varying gender identities. But I do think there's a lot of value in continuing the conversation to ensure that every perspective is heard and that we are thorough in whatever approach that we are taking moving forward. I would also like to say Mr. Marsh spoke very passionately about things at the high school when he was posed with the question pre versus post 720, what concerns have the student reported? And although he was offering his perspective, I do know that his perspective is also based on not only his personal interactions with students, but his conversations with his counseling colleagues, his administrative colleagues, his knowledge of PAYS data, his knowledge of climate survey data. So I just wanted to point that out because I don't think that his perspective is limited to interactions that he's had with students, but it is a combination of interactions that he's had with many other colleagues and sources of information that have been made available. So I just wanted to offer that perspective. Thank you.
I appreciate your.
Colleagues say you didn't know about my daughter.
I appreciate your perspective, absolutely, especially as an observer to our excitement that this is actually. I think it was productive. Truly, I thought it was productive. So, I think at this point, with regards to what was presented, go ahead, Dr. Weston. I know that she has. If you have something to add with regards to the AR or just what was on the agenda, please do so. Because I feel like everybody's voiced their stance.
I have a question about when 720 was implemented, there was an alternative that had criteria that was not accepted.
That was the
Could that
first version of it.
criteria fulfill what Mrs. Rudolph is asking for?
So
I think that would be very helpful.
To put some context, thank you for asking that. I wasn't trying to, the first round, how we got to 720 as it was adopted, was actually, that wasn't the first pass.
Correct.
Right, so the first pass was not voted in and accepted. If you could just, if you dial it back.
Yeah,
with that
the only
history.
thing I can add to that is that the initial policy raised questions, it was revised, proposed again.
And it was called 720.
It was called 720 both times, but offered some revisions the second time around that the board then ultimately approved it. The first version of 720 was more comprehensive and did include more language than where we landed in the policy that was approved by the board.
I believe it's the one that Dr. Kolar presented.
No, well, that's
That's
separate.
not 720.
That's actually,
I'm
yep.
sorry. I'm sorry. I was referring to the 720s. There were two versions that we looked at some point.
I'm referring to Dr. Kolar's
So So that's
criteria.
So that's a separate.
Okay.
So that was a separate alternate policy in it to combat the presentation of a revised 720. So that's how it all mapped out. So 720 was initially presented. It was voted down. I think it was 5-4 to not adopt 720. Then conversation was happened, and that was the only time that it came to policy. And Mr. Fountain actually chaired that policy meeting with a revised 720 that was developed. And ultimately, that 720 was then taken directly from the policy without really any true community debate, directly to the board meeting, was voted on again, and passed 5-4.
So 720
During that
did go to
meeting,
policy.
I'm sorry?
You said 720 never went through policy. It did
The
go
first,
through policy.
the first 720 as presented never went through policy.
That never passed. That doesn't matter. The past version went through policy then, correct? Because you said multiple times
discussed.
that it was never
Okay.
discussed at policy.
You got me. You got me.
No, it's not a got you. you
So it's okay. Yes, the original 720 as presented by you was not. It's okay.
It doesn't
But
matter.
you were the one that brought it to everyone's attention.
Yeah.
Never went through policy. That just landed at the board.
Correct.
Then after that was voted down, everybody was like, okay, well, we still want to push this forward, so we're going to revise it. And so that is when it came to policy. From there, if everybody's following the bouncing ball, came through policy. We had the one meeting about it. The policy committee at that time did not recommend pushing it to the board for approval. However, it was a split decision, and so then it came to the full board on the agenda at the next board meeting. 720? The language for, as I understand it, because I wasn't part of its development, the language in the revised 720, it was reported to the board that it was created by Mr. Dorr and Mr. Fountain.
Around what? What did they use as their model?
The original version.
Okay, the original version.
Mr. Dorr spoke
Hold on.
about he works in medical facilities, and he said that this is what he did a lot of research on what they're using in medical facilities for the community and for the staff.
So-
And he looked to see what was working.
So I'm not questioning the validity of what was developed. What I'm saying is that this is the bouncing ball of how we got here. Mrs. Lofton, do you have something to add? Microphone.
I believe that the policy that Mrs. McGee is referring to, I pulled back up.
So I'm getting to it. That's
Okay.
what I'm getting to. So after that happened, 720 revised came to the board for a vote. It just appeared on the agenda. It was not a recommendation of the policy committee. Did you guys have something to add? Microphone. Oh, yeah. Well,
What is the end result
clear
of
as mud.
today? Because there's an AR that we're talking about.
That's where I'm getting to.
And then there's a policy,
Yep.
right? So I want to know at the end of the day, are there going to be boys in the girls' bathroom? Are there going to be boys playing on my daughter's volleyball team? Because if that's the case, we've got a big issue. And there's a number of women here. And the one thing that I have a hard time understanding is that any woman could support a man taking over a woman's world, and specifically to sports. Like, we fought for decades to earn a place at the table, to earn a seat at the table, and we have women here who are so willing to just let men into our world everywhere, our bathrooms, now our sports, the locker rooms.
I hear
So
what
what,
you're- I
at the
hear
end
what
of the
you're
day,
saying.
what happens now? Do I have to worry about taking my daughter out of school and finding a new place to put her where she'll be safe?
I'm getting to what's next. I'm getting to what's next.
Ms.
I
White,
will
could I throw a crazy idea out there? I'm just gonna stay out of the box. How about putting this on a referendum on a ballot for the community to vote on? Is that something that we can possibly do? That way you'd really get an idea of where the community feels that this should go.
So I would argue throughout the last 2 years that we've just had an election. And so with that, to follow the bouncing ball,
I guess the answer is no on that then, huh?
I want to point out that in response to 720 appearing on the board agenda without the recommendation of the policy committee, Dr. Kolar, to your point, Mrs. McGee, and to Mrs. Lofton reference, presented a policy in contradiction to the content of 720. And that was voted down, and 720 was voted in. And I think that happened in October. Okay. So now we're in January. December, we tried to right the ship a little bit and pull it off without having discussion. I asked for it to be taken off and suspended and then come back to policy committee. That was voted down to have it suspended, and yet still we are at policy committee. In development of the policy agenda for tonight's committee meeting, which is my first, I asked Dr. Russell to bring to the committee a solution in response to the way 720 was poorly developed in procedure and approved. And to speak to that, the recommendation is as presented with the AR and not 720. Now, going forward, should there be additional policies that are presented to the committee for consideration, including the one that similar to the one that Dr. Kolar presented, similar to the one from Norristown that Mr. Saylor mentioned, similar to the ones that
Dr. Weston, I didn't mention that.
you mentioned Norristown.
No, he mentioned Montgomery. I have no
He
interest in that
mentioned
policy.
he mentioned his own research. You mentioned Norristown. There's Downingtown, and we can go on and on. If those would come to policy, we would have a conversation just like this. So, where it goes from today is that we are moving forward with the committee's recommendation, which we're going to ascertain in a second, as to what will happen for the board agenda, and then go from there. So, my question is, for committee members, whether or not the agenda as presented by administration is supported by the committee.
No.
Mr. Saylor and Mr. Keenan both don't support that. Mr. Marsh? But I would like a consensus from the committee. I think that's where we're coming from. Say it again? So do you support the recommendation of adopting the AR in lieu of 720?
Based on the politics in the room, I do not.
Because you,
I hate to give into that, but I don't want to have further disruption.
Dr. Weston?
It's not a first read.
It would be,
It's an AR.
it would be the adoption of the AR in lieu of 720.
No, boards don't adopt ARs.
Revoke 720. Thank you, Mr. Saylor. Just do that too. Who else do we have here? Mr. Cleland?
I think I'm also not a voting member.
But I guess
I know.
I'm looking for temperature.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'd support that as it is, because transgender students have the same rights as everybody else, and I don't want to do something that
Don't
takes away
interrupt.
their
No.
rights. And the
Don't inter-
policy
don't
720
interrupt, please.
has done that to my transgender students, so I'm gonna have to vote for them. So yes, I would approve that. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Cleland. I hope that that didn't put you on the spot. That was not my intention. I really am looking to do right by not only those that are, in essence, feeling like they're protected in some illusionary fashion by 720, but also the least among us. And I think that that, to me, has always been my main concern. And so, for that reason, I would support taking 720.
Hold on.
Disruptive way then, the least, like the most productive way. I feel like just pushing it through is the concern in the first place.
Right. So we're going to undo that and start from scratch.
We want to give careful consideration to this community. We're not there. So you're just.
So what it's not premature because we're starting from scratch.
Mr. Marsh just.
Dr. Russell?
We're not even agreeing with the whole thing. And Mr. Marsh just told told you that he wants the least amount of disruption.
Mr. Marsh wants the least amount of disruption because he doesn't have confidence that this won't cause disruption.
I don't either. I agree with them.
No, I'm saying from this room. The disruption comes from this room, not our kids. That's what I'm saying.
What was
To
the
be clear.
walkout? You called the walkout a disruption.
It was.
You say 99.9% of kids fall in line.
But
They
I'm
still
saying
vape.
we have
They
an
still bully.
opportunity,
They're not
we have
falling
an
in line.
opportunity here to set an example for our kids. If you want to dialogue this policy here, that's great.
So we're not pushing anything. I'm so sorry, Mr. Marsh. I wasn't. You don't have to defend your position at all, in my view.
I have a position. I'm just providing facts.
Correct. That's 100. I agree. You're asking about pushing it forward. This is a committee recommendation to the board of a whole. That's all this is. We're not pushing anything forward.
We now open up 720 and start talking about that?
I mean, it's not on the agenda.
Yes, it is. It's right there.
Could I just recommend that, like, maybe y'all have, like, small meetings with with the girls?
I agree that should have happened before the adoption of 720.
Well, and I would think, like, before you take away.
But it shouldn't have ever been in place to begin with.
But here it is now, and we've got, before you take that option away, I have a teenage girl, and I work with teenage girls. I've got girls that are walking in that bathroom that have leaked from their periods, and they're going in there mortified. And I remember that happening to me as a freshman. They're going in there mortified, and now as they will walk in, they're going to Wawa, and before I even walk into Wawa, and like I have to kind of like prepare myself. I'm a grown woman. I'm almost 50 years old, and I have to prepare myself that I might have to walk in on a man. Like, and so then I have to think like, oh my gosh, like my poor daughter, like she has to kind of worry about that, and like every other poor daughter. Like and I'm not saying like have it in a big room like this, because I know my daughter has that fear of like, if I say anything, it's looked as this, you're a transphobe, you're a this phobe, and you're a that phobe. It has nothing to do with that. Nothing. Like she has full love in her heart for everybody, just like I do. These kids do not feel comfortable. Being a teenager is hard enough. Y'all, being a teenager is hard enough, and being a teenager right now is really hard. Trying to, like, they need structure. They need, like, some real stuff. And this world like this, where there's absolutely no structure, no right, no wrong, no absolute truth, it's too much. It's too much. And these girls, like, they are just like, we don't even know that we can walk into our bathroom. Like, my daughter doesn't know that she can walk into her bathroom without drugs. And now she's got to worry about boys being in there. Like, my suggestion would be, before you take away that one last little piece of like that, and here's the thing, thank God we supposedly have not had a safety issue. Thank God that we have supposedly not, because is that a guaranteed? Absolutely not. Because some girls have not come to all of you, that does not mean that something has not happened, and all of you know that. All of you know that.
Ms. White, may I make a suggestion? Can we send this to the Wellness Committee? That's where the counselors lie. Those are the individuals that deal with the students who have needs and have wants.
I absolutely think the Wellness Committee should absolutely have conversations, and I think that the community conversation needs to continue. There is no question. The question that's on the table is how we're going to move forward. The answer was, from recommendation of administration, meaning Dr. Russell, was that we remove 720 from policy and we institute an AR to support the behavior of kids in and out of restrooms. So I guess, Dr. Russell, you're the last committee member that I didn't. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Mayers.
I just wanted to add one more thing, and that's it, and then I'll be done. I was just going to.
You need to talk on the microphone. She wants to talk. She will speak.
Well, I want to let you finish. And
okay, I was just going to add one more thing. thank God we have not supposedly had any like safety issues, but we know that through the US, like these many schools have been changing their policies, and we know, as much as the media has been trying to like cover it up and hush 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 and hush hush hush, that there has been sexual assaults happening throughout the entire US. We know that this has happened not once, not twice, not 3 times. And I am not saying in any stretch that that is going to happen to PV. But what I am saying is that what we are going to wait for? Are we going to wait for an assault to happen? And I'm not saying that it could happen from somebody who is gender fluid that day and deciding. Are you, like, I work with teenage boys and they joke like, oh, ha 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 ha, like, you know, this school's going to do this and we're going to be a girl for the day, ha ha ha. Are we going to wait for this to happen where there is no structure, there's this opportunity, with opportunity comes things like this. This administration, are you going to turn to me, my husband, my daughter, and say, I am so sorry, we did not mean for this to happen? Or one of y'all? Why would we wait for something to happen? Nothing has happened so far. Wonderful. So let's not open that door. We do have individual bathrooms. The majority of the school body, like, let's look at the statistics here.
Okay.
So that was
Listen,
it.
No, and I appreciate, honestly, your passion. I appreciate it. And we are all truly, I can honestly say that we are all here because we care not only about our community, but our children. There is no question. No question. Wellness committee is a thing. I implore you, please join the conversation with that committee as well, because it's in committee that you're able to have this open dialogue and everybody can have a voice. That it really is, it's really important. Mrs. Mayers.
Okay, so 2 things. One, we're talking about hearing voices that are hard to hear. So I'm Kim Mayers. A lot of people know me, and I have a deep connection to the differently abled population. And I have had parents come to me at football games. My own son has asked me questions and have said, my 2 parents who have daughters who have IEPs, that their daughters are afraid to go in their bathroom because they're so first of all, they have an IEP. So and the 2 people that I was speaking to their children have intellectual disabilities. So they're struggling to even understand the world as we experience it. And then you throw this on top and they're concerned. And the one girl didn't even want to go to school. So that's truth. My son has asked me lots of questions that I won't go into, but that is brought up by this conversation that's happening about boys being in girl spaces and all of that. Secondly, I believe I heard from you, Ms. White, that you were going to respect community voice and that you wanted to, and I appreciate the open forum and I appreciate the conversations, but I have to go back and re-listen, but I thought I heard you say that you were going to take in all the voices and then figure out how to move forward. And I'm asking Dr. Russell, too, we don't like, PV is an awesome community, and this up and down is very uncomfortable for everybody. So I'm hearing from some people that work in the schools asking that we not upset the apple cart. So I'm asking, like, other community members came to many of our meetings and implored us to, in different aspects, and it was done most of the time, that things were put through to policy or a task force was created or there were community conversations, and that's all I'm asking for, that we not make a decision in 2 weeks.
So I respect that point of view, Mrs. Mayers, and you and I, throughout our 4 years together, there were many, many times that you and I agreed on very many things over the 4 years. And so what I'm trying to create now is a dialogue and writing some of the things that I felt were not handled in the way that I would have handled them. And so in the spirit of that, in allowing for the dialogue and the conversation to happen, in my view, righting the wrong and not upsetting the apple cart has already happened with the introduction and the way that this policy was introduced. And that could be argued both ways, okay? We didn't certainly get into a room and talk like this about it. No one can disagree with that. I think the conversation...
There was a policy. You keep saying that. Yes, we did get to a room like this. Don ran the meeting. You kept saying there wasn't a room. There was a policy meeting.
Okay, so in my view, as a policy member during that meeting, I didn't feel as though there was a forum, an open forum to have dialogue like we're having tonight. And I don't think as many people came out and weighed in. That's my genuine feeling. And I think that the conversation and the dialogue needs to continue to happen. I think that there are challenges in every one of our homes for a whole manner of reasons. But at the end of the day, it's my view that this did not happen the way that it should have and should never have been adopted in the first place. And for that reason, I support the removal, the reintroduction of some sort of path to address the issues that are in front of us, and then to put the AR in place. The recommendation was about the AR, so that's what the focus of the conversation was about. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry you feel that way. It's simply.
But we didn't discuss 720 and fix 720, and that's what the board members, the 5 board members voted on to have it come to policy to look at 720 and fix 720.
But okay, yes. We can go back and forth. We can go back and forth all night. But it's my recommendation, and Dr. Russell, I defer to you because ultimately.
You still don't want to discuss 720. You just want to get rid of it like last time, except now Dr. Russell has provided something to use that we didn't even get to fully look at.
No, what do you mean you didn't get to fully look at it? We can read through the whole AR. It's been up on the.
I know, but that's not what's being discussed. Dr. Russell presented this as, we still want to just get rid of 720, but the conversation, the point of the board meeting vote was to come and discuss 720 at policy.
And you feel like that's not happened. We've spent the last 2 hours talking about 720.
Discussed that there's a lot more to discuss about how to fix 720, what to look at about modifying 720.
Okay.
So can we, I would like to.
So then 720 will, in my mind, come back to.
At 720 and figure out what can happen with 720.
But that has nothing to do with replacing the AR. And the legality of it.
No, the AR can be put into place, and I would agree based upon all the conversation this evening, there needs to be more conversation on 720. You know, to Mr. Marsh's point, I'm concerned about a disruption. I also like the idea of going to the Wellness Committee. And what I think is also important is that we need to talk to more students. I'd really like to hear from more students about where they are with respect to what we as adults are actually recommending. So the AR can be put in place. Policy 720 can come back to Policy Committee next month.
No, it can't.
For further
That's
discussion.
not true. Hold on.
Well,
Can the
so,
board member,
so
wait a
that
second.
would be
Policy, the AR cannot be put in place until Policy 720 is deactivated, because the AR is against the policy, and no AR and you cannot create an AR that goes against a school policy.
Nothing will happen until the board meeting, I think is the point.
And yeah, just to that point, Mr. Seller, you could also argue the AR aligns to 103, which is in place. It is non-discrimination.
No, that's not true.
It aligns to 103, that exists also. So it's one policy against the other.
So no, the AR is specifically designed to remove Policy 720. There's nothing in Policy 103 that mentions the term bathroom. It's a Title IX in discrimination. And so the adjunct of the AR would then say, and the onus of 103, the onus of the original Policy 103, the onus of Title IX, we've gone through this ad nauseum, was to ensure that female students and females in the workforce weren't being discriminated against, weren't being promoted, weren't given equal opportunity, that students in STEM, that teachers weren't not picking students for STEM because they were black, because they were female, that they weren't using anything against them to have that give them that same ability so they weren't discriminated against. The AR's creation is sole intent to remove Policy 720, or 2/3 of 720. because it doesn't discuss locker rooms and it doesn't discuss visitors access. So 720 would need to be removed first. But the onus of the policy was to discuss 720, which we have not done, and then that's perfectly fine. We didn't do that tonight at all. We didn't discuss we didn't discuss maybe creating other items in policy 720 that would affect the change that the administration wants and what other board members might want. We're just ripping it up, which is fine. That's the will of that could be the will of the majority of the board, and we'll find out at the board meeting. But to be extremely clear, the onus of the AR was to not have discussions tonight on policy 720 and was to actively see its removal. And that then gives the administration and the House principal access and covenants through PIAA regulations and through how 103 is being used to facilitate locker room access, to facilitate bathroom access, and to facilitate sports access as they like without policy.
The purpose of bringing up the AR for 103 was, again, in an effort to be transparent. As I've said a couple of times already, I never felt like the district needed policy 720. However, I recognize tonight the concerns and the views. We are in different places, and I think additional conversation could be helpful. So the way that you phrase some of the statements that you just made are not ones that I would agree with. That was not the purpose of this AR. It wasn't to eliminate 720. However, it was, and we've talked about 720, it sort of overlaps some of the conversation. Yeah. The language of 720 was not called up and looked at line by line. You're absolutely right. There was an intent, though, to cover the topic and to provide an opportunity for transparency in this AR. That was the intent. So that's phrased a little bit differently than what you just said.
So,
You know,
so there's no protection in place, and the discrimination.
So there are many. You're saying that there are many more safeguards that need to be developed, and I don't disagree with any of that. So we heard all of that, and there is the decision. I mean, I honestly, other than allowing a voice and working towards a compromise, what were we expecting? Mrs. Rudolph, what were we expecting?
Okay, all right. You know what we're doing? I said this before.
Microphone. Yeah, it's okay. You said you didn't want to be on camera, but I disagree. I think that you are the star tonight.
I'm not. I just, Mama Bear,
I got it. Me too. Got it.
Okay. The books. When did the book topic start? Yet, I don't even remember. 2 years ago, it doesn't matter. It was a long time ago. Yet here we are, still working on it, right? Because we want to get it right. Now this new information came down with rules and legal language and everything that we have to follow. So now we're utilizing that as a resource. It's complicated.
It is complicated.
And so is this.
Engagement is the only saving grace of anything that's come out of any of this is engagement.
Okay. So you asked me what I wanted to get out of this.
Now we're talking about this agenda item.
Yes. Okay. I would like to see it have the same attention and careful thoughtfulness, consideration, everything, which is what you asked for in the first place. I'd like to see that finally happen where it goes to wellness, where it doesn't need to be disassembled, have this AR in. What I would like to see happen is that it has the same consideration as the books.
Thank you. Yes, noted. And that's a legitimate ask. Thank you. Are there any closing thoughts before we move on to policy committee minutes? Yeah. Go ahead.
You know, opening everything back up and going with the AR and going back to identity and what people feel, that opens it back up to anybody can be anything. I could be a teenage girl looking to enroll in school tomorrow. I could be a dog. Am I allowed to go take a crap out in the middle of the hallway?
I'm going to stop you there because up until this point, we've had a really professional, constructive conversation. That to me is in line with disrespect.
It's a
And it
valid
can be,
question.
it is not a valid question because that point of view is considered hateful to those who hold an identity different than the one they were given at birth. And whether or not you acknowledge that is irrelevant. But that dialogue is at the core of all of this, and it will not be tolerated within this public school while I'm in charge. Let me tell you
It's a
something.
legitimate concern.
We can't do that. We're not allowed to do that and as the board members. We're not allowed to stifle First Amendment. So whether I like what he said or
It is not a it is not appropriate. And as a human
the truth,
being,
though.
it is
Is
not
it-
appropriate for me to sit and let you.
But is that the truth? It opens it up to the possibility of that.
Is that how you behave in your life, sir?
The honest question.
Okay. So we've now, I feel. Well, you've made the same point, Mr. Keenan, and I will not entertain it when you say it or when he says it.
Talking about it the whole meeting. What is the standard? There is no way to prevent somebody from identifying. It's just that there is no standard. That's the problem. And
Okay.
we're talking about the whole meeting.
Okay.
We have to be careful as board members telling members of the community in our meetings
And it's a public meeting.
that they're not allowed to talk if we disagree. That is against.
It is not against the policies of the board to stop hate speech, and it is not against threats. It is just simply inaccurate.
Make a threat, and he didn't say anything hateful. He said something that might be considered ignorant, or that someone might disagree with, but he didn't say anything hateful. We need to be careful.
You know what? You're right, Mr. Saylor. Please continue. Let's hear more about the different things about taking a crap on the lawn. Yep. 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 Yes, 100%. That was a good point you've made. Yep.
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, please, Mrs. Rosas. Go ahead.
Just
Wait,
that
now it's
and to it was a comment that was brought in earlier about whether anyone can go and sign. So first of all, there were the three definitions there regarding the consistency of your behavior. Okay, and then we also heard around there's a difference between how you're identifying and then the behavior that you have. So if you are not consistently identifying in such a way, and then you go into a situation, into the bathroom to play pranks, to do whatever, to be mischievous in whatever way, that's a behavior issue. That was also addressed and talked about earlier with Mrs. Lofton was bringing that up. Why would anybody who is not feeling, who doesn't have these feelings, want to portray themselves to have them? That's the core of the issue here. Why would anyone want to do it? It is a difficult life. There's a lot of challenges in society. If you don't really feel that in your heart, that you have your feeling of a different gender, then why would you want to go forward and act this way? If you did, then it's a behavior issue that was talked about, but Mrs. Lofton was bringing up those points and can be dealt with by the school in a different way. So from my perspective in reading what was described in the definitions, I think it is clear, and I think there is a standard about whether or not this is the consistent behavior, the consistent way that you are portraying, are living your life out in the world, that you're then identifying in this way and that you're showing up that way every day, and therefore that's where the difference is. And if there's a behavior issue, that can be handled separately. So why would anybody want to do that? Why would anyone want to come and live, demonstrate themselves to be disingenuous in that way? I just don't think it's going to happen. I don't think it's an issue. I think we're making something up about it. And if it's a behavior issue, then the behavior can be handled. That's all.
Does anyone
Thank
want
you.
to respond to that question? Go ahead.
I would just respond with there's a lot of people that actually really would, and I hear what you're saying, and you're exactly right. Like sanely, healthily, you're right. Nobody would choose that, but unhealthy people would choose that. And if you think about like you just said, like pranks, things like that, that absolutely would happen. And then there's also kind of the piece of a lot of kids that are going through just gender issues. A lot of times, like there are so many other like traumas and things like that are going to be underlying. Like that's just one of many issues that they're dealing with, and that could be a lot of times those are stages that they're going through. So like we're dealing with a lot of comorbidity in terms of like multiple diagnoses, that we're dealing with as well. So like I wish that we could say, that we're not going to see anything like that. But like and like I said, PV has not seen that yet. Mm-hmm. But we're just beginning. But other schools that have already said, okay, we're progressive and we're going to do this, other schools have seen that, whether it be, and I know at least a few of them, these were not children that were actual children with gender dysphoria. Mm-hmm. So that was true. These were not children with gender dysphoria. These were children that were pretending to have gender dysphoria, and they came in and did some very terrible, terrible things. But it is happening, and it has happened.
But
so
that could happen with and without a policy, though. In that
100%.
regard. And so it goes back to a behavior situation. You know what I'm saying?
Right, absolutely.
So I don't think that discriminating against the trans community with the policy that we have is going to prevent, I'll just stop there.
No, I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right. Like you're right. Like it absolutely, it can happen anywhere. It could happen at Walmart. It could happen at the school. It could happen anywhere. I think as parents, we're just saying, and a lot of the schools that it has already happened is we're just saying you open the door and you make more opportunities is what we're saying, and that's just one element of it. That's not the only thing. That's just one piece of I think a lot of parents' concerns. But I hear what you're saying. Absolutely.
Are there additional closing thoughts?
I think that you should ask the parents, Dr. Russell, if you should allow men in the women's room.
Do you have closing thoughts, Dr. Russell?
I think I'd like to confer with you after this meeting about our next steps, as well as with administration.
Thank you.
I mean, I really appreciate the conversation tonight, as heated as it got and uncomfortable at some point. It is helpful, so we'll take some of that. I'll confer with Ms. White, and then we'll have a recommendation moving forward.
Great. Okay, good. All right, so the committee meeting minutes will be posted.
Yes.
Let me pull that back up. My computer keeps going quiet. The committee minutes will be posted for the meeting, as well as the video. Meeting dates. So our next meeting is February 20th. So that will be after our first two February meetings for the board. At the end of the month, we have a data presentation. I'll just say that as a matter of course, should anybody care to get into that exciting. 5.03, notice of video disclaimer, and 5.04 is adjournment. And I could not thank all of you more. Sincerely, sincerely thank you for coming out and for speaking so openly and candidly, respectfully for the most part. Thank you very much.